What is a faked up memory you have from your childhood that you didn't realize was faked up until you grew older? My uncle tried to take me to a hotel alone so I could see what a waterbed was like in person. I was 14 and he had just got out of prison, although I did not know at the time what he was in prison for. I said no because I thought my parents wouldn't approve. I found out years later he was in prison for rapping little girls. Edit. A lot of you are asking why he was allowed to be around family members, specifically me or other cousins my age. It's hard to explain to someone not in a dysfunctional family. Denial is very powerful and all of the adults, especially my grandparents, wanted to believe he was wrongfully charged. I was lucky, others were not. He traded a drug addict's car for her infant baby girl. He had her for 6 months before we could intervene and get the girl to safety. He was not sentenced in that case due to errors in the case and it getting thrown out of court. We found last year he was using social media to lure in teen girls to meetings. We turned him into the FBI, but they haven't been able to get enough evidence for an arrest. I always had a memory of two people fighting and me watching it from my dad's car. Always thought it was a dream until my grandma told me the story of it. When I was 2,5, my mother kidnapped me and my dad chased her with his car. Some neighbors blocked my mother's way and my dad basically threw me in the backseat of his car. He wanted to drive away, but my cookie mother put her hands on the front of the car and refused to move. My dad just simply got out, kicked my mother's legs so hard she collapsed. Then he drove away and took me to my grandparents' house. Never saw my mother after that, and I'm thankful. TLDR, what I thought was a very vivid dream turned out to be my very first memory of my father being a total badass. Edit. To give you guys a little bit of a backstory, my mother wanted custody over me, and since she was losing, she thought this would work. This wasn't the only faked up thing she did. She locked me up in a house full of cats, which resulted in me getting horribly sick, body full of scratches, now allergic to cats. She poured shampoo in my eyes if I cried. She beat me and her other kid. She locked my dad in her house, called the cops, and said that my dad abused her. She was an abusive, lying scumbag, so of course my dad was on his last straw with her. My dad tried to take care of her other child too, but she disappeared with the kid. So yeah, please don't make any assumptions about my dad. He gave me the official documents a few months ago. It's a 15-page long sheet chow. I've also met a lot of social workers and witnesses who helped my family. My dad is a superhero for me. Single dads are awesome. Oh, and even though my dad doesn't know a lot about the internet, I'm gonna tell him that over 2K people find him badass. Will boost his ego. Edit 2. He is very surprised and feels slightly embarrassed because he isn't proud of hurting a woman. But he's thankful to all of you and he hopes that none of you will judge him. He also wishes the best of luck to single moms and dads. Once when I was alone in my house, someone started banging on our door. My mom always told me not to open the door, but that guy just wouldn't go away. He kept calling my uncle's name, who at that time had been living with us, so I decided to open the door. My stupid mind figured that if I didn't, he would have broken them down. The guy was drunk and once he got inside, he didn't want to leave. Not thinking too much of it, I actually asked him to tell me a story. He fell asleep in an armchair in the middle of it. My mom kicked him out when she came home. I was lucky this guy was harmless or too drunk. Edit. Since you're wondering, the guy started telling the story of Little Red Riding Hood. I remember being disappointed, cause I already knew it. He knew my uncle, but they weren't friends, both in their early 20s, so I don't really know what he wanted. A place to sleep perhaps. My friend taught me about sex when we were about 6 or 7. She told me what adults do and showed me an erotic drawing from her parents' bedroom. Dad and stepmom who she lived with were definitely alcoholics and probably did drugs too, and her older teenaged step brother was super skeevy. It was only after I got to high school that I realized that some of the things she used to say to me about sex were super fed up. She shouldn't have known as much as she did at the age we were, and I highly suspect now that she was being sexually abused by someone. Edit. I just wanted to say that just because kids know about sex at a young age does not mean that they are all being molested. It is extremely normal / common to be curious about our bodies and play act things we see adults do or in movies. Even learning the word sex can come from anywhere, and when you're a kid, you want to share what you learn with your friends. That's normal. In my case, it was specifically the way in which she knew or talked about sex that later made me believe she was being abused. For things that were very specific, her response to the question, "How do you know this?" was, "I'm allowed to do it." It was weird. And there were other things about playing with her that crossed the boundaries of being normal curiosity. I was just starting my freshman year of high school, so I was 14. I can't remember why, I think marching band, but I was at the high school around dusk one night. I realized that my parents forgot about me and everyone else had left and locked up the school. This was 15 years ago, so I didn't have a cell phone. My school was only a few miles from home in a nice suburban town, so I decided to walk home. Partway home, a guy in a pickup truck pulls along the road and yells out the window asking for directions to the mall. I didn't think anything of it and told him. He then asked me if I could get in and navigate him there, since he still wasn't sure. I was tired and wanted to berate my parents, so I said no and kept walking. It was only a few years ago that I realized he very likely didn't want navigational assistance. And to be clear, I wasn't 14 looking 18. At 29 I get mistaken for 22, and at 25 I was mistaken for 16. Between my face and the way I dressed, I probably looked 11 or so. I was super lucky that he didn't follow me, since soon after where he pulled over the shops and house grew really sparse, and it was getting dark. Thankfully my friend's mom saw me walking and picked me up a few minutes later too. Still creeps me out to think that if I had been less mad or tired I may have gone with. I was very naive. When I was very little, under 5 years, I had severe ear problems and spent a lot of time at ear/nose/throat specialists' offices and had a couple of ear surgeries. As I got older, my ears got better, but I couldn't do things like go underwater for too long, etc. Once when I was older, 13 or 14, I got a severe ear infection to where I could not move my head from a tilted position because I could feel fluids start to reach the infection and cause even more severe pain. I told my parents about it, and my father became inexplicably angry. He insisted that I straighten my head and just suck it up and go to school. I remember him just yelling, cussing, and accusing me of faking illness. I pleaded to my mom that I could not move my head and that it hurt really bad. Finally my father yelled, "Fine, but you're coming with me and I'm going to take you to the doctor." He said it like it was a threat. My parents were self-employed, so we got in the car and he drives me to a house and has me wait in the car while he goes and gives an estimate for service to a potential client. Then he goes to another home to check in his employees. I asked when we would be going to see the doctor and he just said later. We went about his usual business day, buying his workers lunch, seeing clients, etc. and just went straight home afterwards. He must have said 5 words to me during that whole day, and I probably really needed a doctor, or at the very least, antibiotics. To this day I cannot rationalize the events of that day. My parents were never abusive, negligent, mean, although they were tough disciplinarians, or anything like that to us kids. As a dad now, I cannot fathom ever treating my children this way. I wonder what was really going on that I was not aware of. I know when I was younger my parents had health insurance through their employer, hence the early hospital visits. Perhaps when they became self-employed they had no insurance. Still I would never jeopardize my children's health like this on the chance they may be faking it. My mum used to take me to work with her when there wasn't enough money for a babysitter. From around the age of 3/4 I used to hang out in a dive bar most nights. The patrons were cool, used to give me change to buy lollies, or buy me a pink lemonade, or whatever. There were some slot machines in the back and some of the guys let me sit on their knee and push buttons for them. I'd play cards with some of them, got taught how to roll cigarettes for the old guys with arthritis. When I got tired I would just curl up under a table and go to sleep. Looking back as a parent myself now, That is super messed up, and I'm surprised no one called the authorities. It was the early 90s but still. Edit. I know a lot of kids have good experiences in bars with their parents etc. So I thought I'd add some detail as to why this was negative for me personally. I would be there until closing time, generally around 2 or 3 am. My mother would not monitor me at all. I would often walk off down the road and be returned by the guy who ran the service station at the end of the street. She would run errands, buying smokes, or whatever, and leave me there. Some of the patrons were nice and stuff but many were pretty intimidating. Sometimes fights would break out. I remember once I cut myself on chunks of glass on the floor under the table after a fight and my mum made me wait until the next day to take me to get stitches. I think with older kids this probably works a bit better as they are a bit more self-sufficient, or when the other parent picks up the kid as soon as they can. I was 3 when it started. My mother was pretty neglectful at the best of times. One warm afternoon, when I was about 4 to 5 years old, neighborhood kids, my brothers, and I were playing outside our townhouse area. We were playing hide and seek at the time, and this one creepy looking neighbor was watching us. After some time, I was looking for a place to hide and suddenly, this guy pulls me inside their house. I didn't know how to react. I was getting pulled, while all my playmates were looking for their hiding place, so they didn't notice. I remember saying, "Please let me go," over and over, wriggling my hand out. He said he has candies to give out, but it still didn't calm me down. Inside, he had me sit down on the couch, and he sat beside me, his hand on my thigh. I was frozen in fear trying to understand the situation, but I was just scared. Luckily his sister-in-law went in, saw us, and hurriedly took me away from him. He was angry at her as she proceeded to tell him that she'll report him again. She took me outside, apologized for the whole situation, and locked their gate. It turns out that the creepy neighbor of ours was a drug addict and was already done with rehab, but has been doing other things apparently. I never realized how faked what happened to me was until I saw him again a few years later, and a suppressed memory was triggered badly. Mum and I moved houses a lot and there was a time where we used to live on a pretty rough estate. It was a nice enough house, but I was of the age where I wanted to go outside and play with other kids. Mum allowed me a lot of freedom, so I was able to go outside alone as and when I wished, provided it wasn't too late at night. I was 9 at the time. I didn't get to be very picky with my playmates. They ranged from 6-year-old boys who threw bricks at my head to 12-year-old girls who somehow thought dating 25-year-old men was okay. I went into their homes. Cesspit 6-year-old girls with sexual posters all over their walls and makeup everywhere. Siblings under the age of 7 who knew way more about sex than I did. I went into their poorly kept homes, saw the squalor, the horrific conditions in which they lived. Mattresses covered with dirt and filth, food on the floor. It was overwhelming. It opened my eyes and made me realize my mum was either some kind of fairy princess or I was just living a much better life, and it filled me with guilt which I didn't truly understand until I grew older. Most faked up was one day I was home alone. My mum had nipped out to the shops, which were really close by, and our front door was unlocked. One boy from one of these faked up families, who was about 16, came into our house and cornered me, knocked me to the ground, started to undo my trousers. I kicked him away somehow, and he ran off. I had to give a statement to the police, and he was sent away. A few weeks later, his teenage girlfriend threatened to kill me because he was sent away. Bear in mind I was 9 myself. So yeah, got some kid put away because he attempted to rape me, got threatened to be killed over it. We moved shortly after, thankfully. But fuck me, when I look back on it, that was a majorly faked up neighborhood, and I'm amazed my mum let me out at all. Haha. I was an oddball kid and the other kids in my complex did not really like me. I was new, and around 6 or 7 I and all the kids would call me an alien and run away whenever I approached. So I was super excited when these 2 teenagers said they'd take me into the woods and play. They took me to a spot with a tarp, and we played some Area 51 alien autopsy game. Had me undress and lay under the tarp while I was examined. Told me it was a secret game and not to tell anyone. At the time I thought it was super weird, and while I felt a little uncomfortable was just very grateful for the attention. I think I was about 20 when it just popped into my head, hey, I think I was molested. It was super weird realizing it for the first time. It's interesting because throughout my life, when I would hear about couple rapists/serial killers, if often dislike the woman more, because I assumed she was the aggressor who just played the "I'm a poor woman" card to get sympathy after being caught. Only realized later that the bias came from how the two teenagers acted. The girl did pretty much everything, and the guy quietly watched and took orders. I was in 5th grade. I was on hall monitor duty as part of school safety patrol. Overheard a conversation that sounded strange to me and that I didn't understood. 2 other 5th graders were heard having the following conversation. 5th grader 1, what did your sister say? 5th grader 2, she said she'd do it for $60. Do you have a condom? I had never heard that word. 5th grader 1, yes. So she'll meet up with me and I just bring the $60? 5th grader 2, no. You bring me $80 and I set up the date. 5th grader 1, but you just said 60. 5th grader 2, the 60 is what she charges. The extra 20 goes to me for setting you up. I didn't know the 2 boys personally. I never heard more of it. But the conversation was odd and it stood out to me. Only when I got into my teenage years did I realize bro was pimping out his sister. My father was a compulsive gambler and I didn't realize it until I was full grown. When I was 15, my father drove 2 hours out of his way with me in the car to visit a casino. He wouldn't say where we were going until we got there, then had me wait in the car while he went inside, promising to return in a little while. An hour and a half later, I got out of the car and went into the casino looking for him. Security spotted me immediately and kicked me out. Back in the car, another hour went by before dad finally came walking out of the casino. I thought, great, we can get out of here now. But no, it was not to be. Instead he asked me if I had any money on me. When I produced $7 he grabbed it and quickly went back into the casino. 10 minutes later we were driving back home. That's when he asked me to promise not to tell mom where we'd been. This kind of thing happened a time or 2 more as I grew up. Watching him gamble until all of his money was gone, never able to quit winners. It took me more years than I'd like to admit before I realized that my father was a compulsive gambler and had been throwing away precious family resources all my life. I remember feeling tremendously saddened by the realization that, after everything was said and done, my father was a very flawed human being. It took me even more years to realize that all humans are flawed in one way or another and that's really not what matters. What matters is what we do about it. I went to primary school with a girl called Chin. One day when we were about 8 to 10 we had detention together. The teacher left the room and this girl immediately launched into sexual talk 0 to 100 real faking quick. No faking clue where it came from. I'm not even sure what she said to me, maybe because I didn't fully understand it. She grabbed a pencil and masturbated under the desk. She told me in full detail what she was doing. I didn't fully understand what was going on, and I wondered if it hurt, but I never liked her, so I didn't really give a fuck. I tried to ignore her, because I wasn't interested enough in what she was doing to ask any of the questions in my head. I just remember thinking this is wrong. I feel violated, but I couldn't figure out why. There was also a boy in my class, same age, who would grab girls' butts and slide his fingers in the crack, like a credit card. He did it to a couple of girls, and said some filthy shit to us. We knew enough to know it was wrong, but not enough to do anything about it. He targeted me specifically for a few weeks. I remember being super fucking shy too. I was stoked that I had a new friend. I very quickly became afraid of him. I haven't thought about any of this for years. One of my earliest memories, actually, circa 1972. I was probably 3 to 4 years old. I was outside playing with a neighbor kid who was a few years older than me, so 6 to 7 year range. He was older, so I followed his lead for most things. He rhymes with chicken, watch this. Proceeds to take a portion of a mostly straightened out coat hanger and cram it down the throat of a common toad, twist, and pull the poor thing inside out. Now, my poor undeveloped mind didn't react much. Sure, that's not right. I remember thinking that. But, I didn't have what you might call a what the fuck moment. More like just trying to process what happened. Maybe more of a is this what older kids do moment. But, when he said here, you try and produced another toad, well, I passed. Fuck you, Randall, wherever you are. Probably in jail. If not, he probably deserves to be. My dad died when I was really young. My mom was a single parent struggling horribly to take care of us while still dealing with her grief and mental illness, being poor and alone, not knowing how to get help for herself or us. There was a lot of faked up shit that happened as a result. When we were really young, 6 to 12, my brother had behavioral issues and would physically fight my mom sometimes. Sometimes when he hit her she would drop and pretend to be unresponsive or dead. She probably thought it would guilt my brother into stopping, but instead he didn't care, and I'd go into hysterics thinking I'd lost my other parent. She didn't stop doing it. My brother used to have vivid waking nightmares, where he'd scream about men who were coming to kill/take him. On my part, up until I was about 14 I had severe abandonment issues as a result of what happened to my dad. If I was in any kind of a public space, school event, my competitions, and my mom/aunt went out of sight or something, I'd have a panic attack. I always hated sleepovers because I hated being away from my mom and unable to keep her safe. I couldn't be away from home for more than a night without having panic attacks. I still get really nervous being away from my mom for long periods of time, and I'm 25. When I was a lot younger, around 7 to 8, my uncle used to live with us. He would act as the babysitter on the weekends, while my parents worked, because he had weekends off. Well, when I was young, like any other boy, I was super into wrestling. My uncle knew that I was passionate about it, and always offered to wrestle with me. At the time I thought nothing of it, but every time we wrestled he would always do this move, where he would trap my hands in between his thighs. My natural instinct would always be to try and free my hands from his thighs, so I would start trying to pull away, moving my hands around, but him being an adult would overpower me. I would feel a hard object in his basketball shorts when we would wrestle, but being that I was young and didn't know what boners were, I just ignored it. Once I got older I realized what was happening. He would offer to play wrestle knowing I would say yes, then he would trap my hands in between his thighs knowing I would move them around trying to escape, which would lead to me rubbing up on his dick. I never told anyone, and I still see him at family parties here and there, but I avoid him whenever I can. TLDR. My uncle would play wrestle with me and make me rub up on his boner. During the Christmas season, when I was about 7, my brother and I went along with our parents to the local Kmart, where we were usually allowed to hang out in the toy section, as long as we stayed together, while they went off to gather whatever present-wise things they needed to buy without us hanging around. My brother wasn't great at following rules in general, and I'm sure I was being a pain in his 9-year-old that day, so he left me in the Barbie aisle while he went over 2 aisles to the outdoor toys and gear section to look at the BB guns and such, with instructions that I wait for him there and not move. Back in Barbie land, I'm checking out the doll that I'm considering asking for Christmas, when an older gentleman enters the aisle and begins to make a show of perusing the items in stock and comparing them to a list in a notebook he's holding. After a few moments of this, he makes a show of seeing me, confirming that I have quite good taste in dolls and would likely be able to help him on his quest. He's in search of some toys for his friend, he says, very special ones, and he's not sure if they have what he wants in this store. He asks if he can show me some pictures of the type of toys he's interested in buying. Maybe I've seen them somewhere and can point him in the right direction. Young me was taught to help out older folks, keeping the elderly neighbors company, helping them with their chores, etc. So I didn't immediately think anything overtly strange of this man, and he seemed to be very concerned with finding just the right gift for his friend. I nod my assent, for some reason suddenly tongue-tied, and he crouches down to my level and pulls out some Polaroid type photos from within the notebook he's holding. While I'm watching, he flips through them one by one, before handing me the stack and telling me to get a good close look at them. With cold fingers, I did as I was told and flipped through them on my own. Looking closely, not seeing any toys I was familiar with, I handed back the stack and told him sorry, but I couldn't help him and I needed to get back to my parents. As soon as I was to the end of the aisle, I nearly sprinted down to the end of the section to grab my brother, and no questions asked he grabs my hand and we both booked it across the store to find the parents, neither of us really knowing what suddenly felt so off, but both of us feeling it. I say nothing about my encounter with the man. Parents, also apparently picking up on the weird vibe, don't say boo about us ruining any Christmas surprises by not waiting for them to come find us and immediately head to check out and leave. Neither bro nor I ever desired to tag along on a shopping trip again, unless we had to stay with them, and I personally never set foot inside a Kmart again unless compelled. Also, never wanted to play with a Barbie doll again. None of these weird feelings ever really made sense to me until several years later, when I saw Born for the first time, and I suddenly knew that's what that man was trying to show me. The photos were hardcore pornographic, most containing a dominant and a submissive. I clearly remember a man on all fours with a Red Bull in his mouth and someone standing over him with a whip, and all their clothing was just straps of leather. Since figuring it out, I've never really known what to do with it. I suppose it's just a faked up memory I have to live with, and pray that my baby girl will never have to live with anything like it. TLDR, creepy eye-shoulder dude approaches 7-year-old girl in Barbie aisle of Kmart to show her amateur porno Polaroids, and ask where he can find toys like that. When I was 3 or 4, my mom started talking about how, when I grew up we would still live together, and be best friends, and do everything together. I think I vaguely understood that wasn't how growing up worked, but with typical toddler bluntness I apparently said, but when I grow up I won't need you anymore. Granted, that would probably hurt a lot of parents' feelings, but my mom took it further than that. From then on until I was in my teens, anytime I did anything that made her angry she would screech about this incident and point to it as proof that I was a terrible, selfish, unfeeling sociopath and that she knew at that moment she wouldn't be able to trust me to take care of her when she got old. I remember feeling ashamed for years and also angry at her for bringing up something that had happened so long ago that I had apologized for many times. It wasn't until I was in my early 20s that I realized that this was pretty mild on the spectrum of toddler burns and how deeply screwed up it was for her to obsess over that or use it as a trump card. The whole accusation of not taking care of her did end up being a self-fulfilling prophecy. In my 30s I realized I had to cut her out of my life for the sake of my husband/child and my own family. When I was about 5 I remember my dad waking me up from a deep sleep, throwing me into a back of a car and driving somewhere. A car followed us, and we stopped a motel. Outside was a motorcycle that belonged to my mother's friend. I made a comment and my dad parked. He told me to stay in the car and he knocked on the motel room door. I didn't listen, because I thought I was going to see my mom and or her friend. He knocked and didn't realize I was there. My mom answered and just a silk robe and guy ran through the background naked. My dad started chewing her out, and I started to cry. Both parents didn't know I was there, and looked down at me with horror. I started crying, because I was confused why my mom didn't come to snuggle with me. That night began my parents' 2-year-long divorce and 7-year custody battle. As I got older, and told someone about this memory I realized it was my mom cheating. She ended up pregnant with 2 of his kids and they married each other. My mom was a terrible person who gave up her rights to me once because she wanted a new life. Also she ended up very physically abusive and abusing drugs. She kicked me out 9+ years ago and I haven't seen her or my brother since. The innocence of me being a kid made me miss so many big red flags. Like me meeting her friend she told me we were going to live with. I think I was about 8 and playing in the park. There's a new kid at school named Kulikov who seems a bit weird. Anyway I'm at the park playing when the new kid comes over. Turns out he lives in the house next to the park. No dad, just him and his mum. He asks me to come over to his house so I say okay to be friendly. Inside is fine but a bit quiet. Seems a bit messy, but I think they've only just moved. After a while he asks me if I want to see something interesting. I say okay. He proceeds to tell me his mum is a super heavy sleeper. You can go into her room and she will never wake up. Do I want to see? This was full daytime, maybe 12 o'clock. I say no thanks. What do I care? I'm a little boy. I have no interest in girls yet. But he keeps bugging me to do this, so in the end I give in, and we tiptoe into his mother's room, and sure enough she is sleeping on the bed, and doesn't wake up. From what I can see she might be naked, certainly isn't wearing any visible clothes. Posture is a bit weird for someone sleeping, on her back, head slightly turned to one side. Can't hear any snoring or anything. Not that I noticed this as a child, just thinking back on it in later years. From memory she was actually good looking and fairly young, possibly around 30, which was old to me at the time. Now he asks me if I want to see her body. What? He says she's such a heavy sleeper we can pull the blanket down and have a look at her if we want. By this time I'm seriously weirded out and say no thanks. He says I'll show you, and reaches forward and grabs one corner of the blanket and starts pulling. Just as one of her boobs is about to pop into view I run out of the room, out of the house, then all the way home. Never went to his house again. For some reason the kid hated he after that, and a few years later, when he made friends with another loner, the two of them tried to beat me up, which didn't work well for them. Thinking back, I obviously can't be sure, but I think not only was he weird, so was his mum. I think she may have gotten off on having little boys see her body. I don't think she is really asleep, and I think this wasn't the first time they'd done this, but who knows. TLDR, my bus driver was a child molester. I remember, when I was 8 or 9 we had a substitute bus driver, the same one as we usually had when our normal one couldn't make it, which was fairly frequently, if my memory is correct. He was older. He had a son a year older than I who I played soccer with, and he was a friendly guy. He was no stranger, but he wasn't a close family friend either. One day I remember a few people who were after my stop were all absent or stayed after school, so my stop was the last. We also took a different route because of it. This had also happened before and wasn't unusual. I was sitting in the middle of the bus, now all alone minus the driver, with my head sort of down, when I realized the driver drove past my road. My kid self panicked momentarily, then went up and reminded him I was on the bus, and we laughed. He said he hadn't seen me, and he turned around and dropped me off. I remember he was a funny guy, and I had always liked him well enough. Looking back it was a bit odd though. I always talked to him on the bus when I got on. Years later, he messaged me on Facebook. I was in college at that point. He asked me how I'd been and yada yada. I didn't reply. A few months after that message, he committed suicide because he was found guilty of child molestation, molesting little boys. I always wonder if he really didn't know I was on the bus, and if it was truly an accident. I'm sure it was, really. It's just a little strange looking back. My mom was molested and raped by a family member when she was younger. He was maybe 15 plus years older than her. Let's call him Big J, who my mother also walked in on raping another family member who was only 4 at the time. It is suspected that he's hurt several girls and boys in our family and my mom's old neighborhood in similar ways. When she told her parents, this being the southern US in the 70s, it was swept under the rug and her parents still had him around her, but never left her alone with him. Years later, when I was 7 years old or so, my grandparents have a get together at their home. We now lived in another state from the side of the family Big J belonged to, and I hadn't seen Big J in years, and he's there. He was a towering man, thus the name, obviously changed for this story, but his real name does begin with Big and deaf, so I'd always perceived him to just be different. I never knew he was deaf, so I would still speak to him, as if he could hear me, and just thought he talked funny / could barely talk at all, and had no clue what he'd done to my mother. I remember grabbing his hand and leading him to a room at the back of the house to show him my video games. I remember only a closet light being on in the room and seeing that light bounce off his beady eyes like marbles, and I spoke to him and asked if he wanted to play some Gamma Cube with me. He just had this creepy, knowing smile on his face. I was still holding his hand, totally oblivious. Suddenly my mom walked in, panic on her face. "What are you doing?" I was confused and thought I'd done something wrong. I told her I was just showing Big J my video games. She ushered me out quickly and glared at him. I remembered this incident years later, a few years after she'd told me what he did to her. I'm angry now remembering that she let me out of her sight even for a second, knowing a faking child rapist was in the same house as me, and how I was absolutely a few seconds away from being molested before she came in. She'd left me with my grandparents to go outside several times during this get together, even though she was bitter towards them about never doing anything, and she knew that my grandparents still hung around Big J's parents, my great aunt and my grandmother's sister, the very people who convinced my grandma to let all this stuff go in the first place, and who looked the other way when he molested kids in their own house. At the time, I hadn't yet told her his son, affectionately referred to by the family as Little J, he was also born disabled, though developmentally/mentally, molested me twice a year before, and that my great aunt walked in on that too. Turns out he molested one of my younger cousins as well. Mom actually did something about it this time around, but he only got 2 years in jail for it. He's out now, and Big J's grandmother, Big J's mom, and my great aunt, runs a nursery with an apartment above it. Little J lives there despite the fact that he's a registered sex offender and isn't supposed to be remotely close to places with kids like schools and the like. My mother drove by the house and took pics of him entering and turned it into the police, but they said because she didn't have a warrant on them and wasn't a cop, she would get a stalking charge if she didn't stop, and the evidence was disregarded. To this day, he still lives there. TLDR, unknowingly walked the man who raped my mom as a child into a backroom during a family get together to play video games. She comes in at the last second, probably saving me from also being raped/molested. Son of rapist molests me, is convicted, but is still allowed to live a floor above a daycare a family member owns. It took me longer than I care to admit that normal dads don't leave a bag of bread on the table and fuck off for a week or longer. I had no idea that normal dads don't need beauty powder and special smoke as soon as they came home from work. As it turns out, my dad was actually a major drug addict who was doing coke, crack and enjoyed a lot of weed. Weed's okay, it's the hard shit I'm mad about. He spent all his money on drugs and hoes, so that's why we had bread sandwiches and he would disappear for weeks at a time while I was alone at home. Which brings me to another point. It's actually really faked up to demand your child refer to your various prostitutes as his new mom is sheets cray. On the bright side, he had very limited custody as it was, and as soon as I started wising up to what was going on, the courts revoked all custody and visitation on his side. When I was a little kid, I often had nightmares due to my parents allowing me to watch all kinds of horror movies. It was a family event to watch a horror movie every night. Anyhow, I got scared by the movie we had just watched and asked if I could sleep with them. They agreed. I got into bed with them and slept on the very edge of the queen-sized mattress. I just remember my mom comforting me with her eyes rolled back with a funny look on her face. Now, my mom was and always has been a partier, so it didn't seem too out of the norm for me, but the comforting thing was weird. Eventually I went to sleep. Now that I'm older, I realize what was going on. My parents were having sex right next to me. And I'm sure that wasn't the only time, but it's the time that stands out the most. Honestly, I could go on for days about stuff like that from my childhood. Then as an adult man, I was sitting with my girlfriend, and I was lying in bed watching TV with her, and she kept putting her hand over my crotch and just resting it there. I don't know why, but in a non-sexual setting, just having her hand there really bothered me. So I moved her hand away. She must not have noticed it bothered me and put it closer. I got really angry and wanted to yell at her and tell her to fuck off. That's when I realized being touched like that as a kid really made me feel defensive about being touched. Then as an adult man, I was sitting with my girlfriend and I was lying in bed watching TV with her, and she kept putting her hand over my crotch and just resting it there. I don't know why, but in a non-sexual setting, just having her hand there really bothered me. So I moved her hand away. She must not have noticed it bothered me and put it closer. I got really angry and wanted to yell at her and tell her to fuck off. That's when I realized being touched like that as a kid really made me feel defensive about being touched. So I called my mom and was like, how the fuck could you let your son be touched like that? My mom laughed and said, oh, she did it because she's celebrating you're the firstborn male Anne. I said, no mom, that was straight up abuse. And my mom said, okay fine, I'm sorry, in the most insincere way ever. Sorry in advance if this is really long. From 1st 7th grade, I would have catechism every Monday night, basically a Catholic religion class that's only about an hour and 15 minutes long. My dad forced me to go into these classes for years, even though I'd tell him repeatedly I had no interest. My mom didn't care if I went or not. You're supposed to go until the end of your 8th grade year, when you get confirmed into Catholicism, but I never went through with it. That's a story for another time. This story was from when I was in 1st grade. So this one Monday night, my dad drops me off at the school next to the church for catechism. This started at 6 p.m. and went until about 7:10 to 7:15 p.m. Once the class had ended, I walked outside the door ready to be picked up, but realized my dad wasn't there. One by one, every classmate starts to leave, until I'm the only one there. It's now 7:45 and the teachers/nurses at the school are trying to comfort me. They take me to the office, where they try to call my mom, who was at work, and couldn't answer. I'm fighting back tears at this point, because it's almost 8 p.m. and I felt abandoned in this place I wasn't comfortable at. Finally my dad shows up, and we leave. He tells me there was a really bad accident and that's why he was late. I almost could have believed it, but he underestimated the fact that his 6-year-old daughter could recognize the smell of the alcohol that lingered on his breath. I knew there wasn't an accident. He just went to the bar to kill time, got drunk, and forgot to pick me up for nearly an hour. When my mom got home, after listening to the voicemail from the school, she was livid, and I knew by the way she screamed at him. I knew it was faked up, but I didn't realize just how faked up it was until I was a bit older and realized that he willingly put my life at risk like that. Sometimes I still wonder if this was really a thing that happened, but that night I went home and wrote about it in the diary I had. I still have it, and it reminds me why I cut him out of my life. I had a friend, female, that I, also female, would visit when my family was visiting my aunt and uncle 6 hours from home. It was couple times a year, more or less. We were both around 9 when we met. She lived walking distance from my aunt and uncle's place. I'd call her up to play, and we'd play at her house. Looking back, she was a bit of a spoiled brat with a wealthy family. She was nice to me though, so we had fun. We'd swim in her pool, jump on her trampoline, and play those role-playing games in her room that kids do, like pretend to be Sailor Moon, or whatever. Well, we got to be around 11 or 12, and she wanted to play a different game. She would be a famous male actor or singer and I'd be a female fan of that person. It got sexual quickly, and it made me intensely uncomfortable. She wanted to kiss me and touch me in the areas my parents had taught me were private. I let it go a few seconds before I asked to stop. She didn't at first, and I insisted. She got upset and said all my other friends let me do it. I made an excuse and basically ran back to my aunt and uncle's place. I didn't tell anyone about it and never contacted her again. It wasn't until I was 16 or 17 that it hit me how inappropriate it was. She was physically larger than me, and when I asked her to stop and she didn't, I couldn't physically make her stop. I was lucky she did. Alcoholic father. Although he had been sober since before I was born. Then, when I was 7, and he was in his early 50s, he had a sort of midlife crisis and started drinking again. Seemed innocuous at first, but it escalated quickly. At the time of this relapse, he had about 19 years of sobriety. And as some of the folks in AA may know, a person's alcoholism continues to grow silently when they are in recovery. So people who relapse after 15 or 20 years often die in the space of a few months. But I didn't know all that when I was 8. After about 3 months, it became clear to my mom that it was a bad idea. She didn't know the half of it in regards to his secret consumption, so they agreed that he would stop drinking. And this information was also passed on to my sisters and me. I was the youngest of 3. So anyway, one day, Pop took me out to spend some quality time together. Looking back, I think he was staying away from home cause things were rocky with mom, and also he wanted to drink. I think maybe we went to get pizza or something, I don't remember. I do remember he was driving kind of fast. After that, we went to a saloon to play pool. I think you know where this is going. I knew what a bar was, and that it was a no-no for Pop. But I didn't know what a saloon was, so I figured it was okay. So we started playing pool. I grew up with a pool table in the house, and it was something Pop and I did together often. I guess I thought it was cool that we went somewhere to play, like, more of an occasion. Funny, since our table at home was really nice, cared for, and level. Way better than bar tables. Pop gets a drink. I watch the lady bartender pour. Looking back, I think he ordered a vodka double. Neat. Looks like water. And at that age, I think I only recognized beer cans as meaning alcohol. Also, looking back, I think I wanted to believe, cause I couldn't handle the idea that my dad was doing something wrong or bad. I asked the woman, is that like dehydrated water or something? I asked. I kicked myself for years over the silliness of that question. She just smiled, thought I was cute. Pop smiled. Everything was fine, I guess. I can't remember how many he ordered. I stopped paying attention to it. Must have been several. I don't know if we were there for an hour or two, but eventually Pop got a call from mom. I don't think he had a cell phone at that time, so I guess she had been calling bars trying to hunt him down. She told him to bring me home. I don't know what he said on the drive home, but I remember it made me mad at mom for ruining our quality time. Pop is pretty infamous for being passive aggressive and guilt trippy and playing the victim. We stopped at the house. I got out, but he didn't, and the engine was still running. I asked him if he was coming in. He said no. I asked him where he was going. He just said, I don't know, but I don't know. When I went in the house, I was crying, and I berated mom for spoiling the day. She didn't say anything that I recall. I don't think she knew how to handle the situation. Obviously she did the right thing, but there's no way she would have been able to explain the situation to my child mind. It's quite possible that she saved my life, though, because the next morning we found out that Pop was in the hospital. He had been arrested. I don't know the details about that part. He had tried to attack the police and the nurses in the hospital. Due to his reptilian braining drunken stupor. Might want to look up alcohol plus reptilian braining. Also he had a blood alcohol concentration of 0.45. So, pretty lucky he survived, not just me. He went straight from the hospital to an inpatient treatment center. I remember visiting him once when he was there. Place really creeped me out. He stayed with treatment and AA for a while. He did all the things legally required of him, and he's been sober now for 21 years and counting. He told me, years later, that when he woke up in the hospital, not knowing what had happened the day/night before, what had happened to me, or if he had killed me, or someone else or something, he said that the blood-chilling terror he felt was so strong, that even if he hadn't gone on to do any treatment or meetings or anything, that he never would have touched the bottle again. He was just done. And I believe him. Nowadays, Pop and I are very close, and he has served as an absolutely vital support in my own life for many years. My 5th birthday party in the early 70s was recorded on an old open-reel tape recorder. It was recorded on the slow speed, over something else recorded on the fast speed. Between segments, a voice recorded at the faster speed said, "Hey." But slowed down it was a spooky, "Hey." For some reason, we attributed it to my seldom seen Aunt Bethy who was in town, and at that party, and up this the Bethy hey. We thought it was hilarious, and would play this part of the tape over and over. A year or 3 later, Aunt Bethy was visiting again, and we excitedly said, "Aunt Bethy, your voice is on this tape from my 5th birthday. Listen." We queued up the tape and played it, and laughed at the hey part. Aunt Bethy immediately got totally defensive, insisting that wasn't me. I didn't do it. It's not my fault. Our mood instantly deflated, and we left the room with a mumbled, "Never mind, Aunt Bethy." Years later, I learned that hyper-defensiveness is a sign of abuse. I wonder how badly our sheet uncle treated her, for her to feel genuinely scared of her 6-7-year nephew's wrath over saying, "Hey" on a tape. Yeah, a thread I have a lot to say in. Parents had me smoke weed from 6 to 18. I'd tell my stepmom I didn't want to, and she'd make me do it anyways. Also made me rub her feet. My memory is shit now. Mother used to starve me and siblings. Alcoholic, spent everything on alcohol. Would get in fights with her husband thing and stab him. Usually stab him in the hand, but I think he took it in the hand to protect his body. Hit him with various things as well. I remember growing up, my half sister didn't live with her, was around 11 to 12, always hanging out with a 24-year-old. He was molesting her. Didn't make sense why an older guy kept hanging out with her. Grandmother used to take a switch to us, thin branch used for striking, that leaves welts and cuts. I was about 4 to 5 at the time. Used to be pretty badly cut from it. Grandfather always drove drunk everywhere we went with him. Stepmom cooked meth when I was around 14 to 15. Didn't understand why I had to buy pseudoephedrine for her, or why we needed iodine or Coleman's propane, or whatever. Couldn't understand why she was being so hateful and crazy. She'd wake me up at 3 in the morning to get her paper. Had to walk 1/4 a mile down the road and back, which wasn't so bad. But why are you going to wake me up, especially when I was having insomnia problems? She karate chopped me in the throat once. Weird. When I was about 7 or 8, I was annoying some older boys. They couldn't have been older than 5th grade, probably in 4th, during recess. Kicking some gravel towards the play equipment they were on, generally being the weird girl who makes dinosaur noises, that kind of thing. Well, one boy finally jumped off the equipment, ran over to me, and stuck his arm down the front of my overalls. He full on grabbed my privates, turned to his friends, and said something like, "Oh yeah," then withdrew his arm and left. At the time, I was just really confused, and I wandered off. I could see he had just done something to punish me for being annoying, but I didn't understand what it was. I thought maybe it was because underwear is supposed to be private, but I didn't know why anyone would want to touch it. I was embarrassed. When I told my mom on the way home, she stopped the car, did a U-turn, and marched into the principal's office with me. Next day I point out the boy to the vice principal. Vice principal thanks me, walks over to the boy, and that's the last I saw or heard anything about it. It took a long time for me to understand why what happened made my very non-confrontational mom so angry, why the boy did it in the first place, and why all the adults took me so seriously. I sometimes wonder about the little boy, and where he learned to use that kind of behavior as a weapon against others, and where he is now. It's not as bad as what many people have experienced, but it's stuck with me for a very long time. Had a friend in early elementary school who would invite me to her house and take me to the fort in her backyard so we could put the non-pointy end of plastic cutlery up our butts. It was her idea. When I was very young, so young my mom would have to help me take a bath. I really hated it when she washed between my legs. It always stung really bad when the soap touched it. As a teenager this memory bothered me because it doesn't hurt to get soap down there, so what happened to me then to make it hurt so much? Also, when I was very young we lived in San Diego and had a couple of Hispanic nannies. One was a young girl, maybe late teens, early 20s. I have a memory of walking down a cul-de-sac at night holding her hand. It was full of cars and people outside in the yards talking and drinking with loud music playing. I remember her taking me into a house and seeing some people sitting on a couch and then nothing. I have no memories after that. As a teenager I was watching a news report about a guy who had stopped some kids on the way home from school and asked if they wanted a ride. I was startled to hear that the guy drove a car the same model and color we had, and that he had a beard like my dad. As the news reporter said, the man was wearing a red shirt. I remember turning my head to see my dad outside starting up the grill. He was wearing a red shirt. My mom and dad divorced when I was 6, and it was ugly. My mom got custody of but she would let me visit him every few months ago. I was a daddy's girl and he filled my head with so much fluff. I wanted to live with just him. As the years went on, I saw him less and less, and I didn't know why. As I got older, I noticed how more and more often his calls became more and more slurred. He slept for most of the time I was there visiting him, but I didn't care because I could watch whatever I wanted on TV. He would let me watch Oz when I was 11 and took me to see the South Park movie around the same time. He slept during most of the movie, anyway. He had a crippling drug problem, and I had no idea, and it didn't make sense until I was much older. The trips to the New Orleans, to score rocks in the 90s, mind you, the ducking in the middle of cooking spaghetti, the loss of my jewelry every time I went to his house, he stole it, the funny smell from whatever he was smoking as I lay on his chest watching television, it was crack, the time spent in jail. He died of a drug overdose when I was 13. I hated my mother growing up because she was my disciplinarian, all the while I had an angel beside me the whole time. My older sister saw a lot more than I did and knew what was going on. She's pretty faked up from it all. My mom waited until she felt I was old enough to handle the information and let me be a kid. I'm forever thankful to her for that. Oof, geez, it feels awful to talk about this, but I should get it off of my chest. So here we go. Reddit. When I was 8 or 9, my mom put me in a Bible camp during the time I was off school, so I'd have something to do during the summer months. It was in this huge old church school type building, and it had a playground in the front yard with a pink plastic playhouse off to the side. Stuff was nice. There was a hepatitis B outbreak there once, but the food was good. I partially enjoyed it. There was a boy there, his name was Jaden, and he was 11 or 12. He was the only kid who talked to me, and I was a really shy weird kid, so I was super grateful. We hung out every day I had to go to camp, and did most of the activities together. He made sexual jokes often, and I laughed along, because I had no idea what the heck they cold meant. I tried to like him as just a friend, but he always wanted more. I felt weird around him, and never really knew why. Later in the summer, his actions began to get stranger. He would act like we were husband and wife, and kiss me all the time, when the supervisors weren't looking. It was so awkward, but he would tell the adults that I hurt him if I didn't go along with his plans. So being the paranoid kid I was, I had to. This vulnerability led to even more things, like that one time where we were making blanket forts, and he laid on the ground and asked me to sit on him. I can still faintly remember how weird it was staring down at him, and I actually just got shivers from it right now. But the worst was still yet to come. A week or so before the summer ended, when we were playing outside in the front yard, he asked me to go behind the playhouse with him. I thought nothing of it. He was being his normal self that day, and hadn't pulled anything, so it felt safe. God, was I wrong? I regret making the one choice that eternally faked up my childhood. When we both crouched behind the playhouse, he did horrible things I'd rather not put into text. I can't even think about them without getting a heavy nauseating feeling in my stomach. Skipping the god-awful sexual assault part, let's just say I have severe commitment issues, and won't go anywhere with anyone alone, unless I've known them for years. Thinking back on it after that entire incident, he eventually left camp to go to high school. I hated going there, and cried every morning I was forced to go, but I never truly realized why, until the memories came back to me quite recently. God, I hope Jaden is living his worst live right now. I hate him. Fuck you, Jaden. I was the only girl in a very patriarchal conservative family, and for whatever illogical reason my parents sexualized and sex shamed me from a very young age. I remember being in 4th grade and being made to do bend over tests in front of my parents so my dad could deem if my shapeless corduroy dress would show too much skin, if I dropped a pencil at school and had to pick it up. Of course, this made zero sense to me at that age. By the time I reached the age of 13, my dad would literally hide behind corners and jump out to ambush me with the question, "Do you still have your most important asset, your virginity?" I was constantly interrogated with questions like this. Other favorite lines were, "Don't advertise unless you're in business, that is, don't wear revealing clothing, and men are visual, it's your responsibility to be modest." At the time I found it mortifying. As an adult, I look back, and my head almost explodes with sheer what the fuckness. It was faked, and as a result, I never had a healthy intimate relationship until my late 20s. When I think of it and all that it led to, I want to vomit, while simultaneously punching something. I have kids of my own now, and the importance of encouraging healthy self-esteem and healthy sexual attitudes is always on my mind. My dad used to beat my mom pretty badly while I was growing up, and it was every day about absolutely anything. She never left or even put up a fight as I was growing up, so it became routine to comfort her after the fact. It was just a normal thing in my life, I'm sad to say. Well, about a week ago, my husband and I were making breakfast, and I had bought chorizo, so we decided to make eggs. He got it open and said, "Wow, you got the good stuff." And I tuned around. Well, yeah. Wouldn't want you to hit me. Insert stupid nervous laugh. WTH. Why would I do that? He has never laid a hand on me, and even I was freaking out about it. I explained that my dad lost his sheet one time when my mom bought a cheaper version of chorizo and gave her 2 black eyes, a twisted wrist, and punched her in the gut so hard she vomited. I didn't even realize it stuck with me that badly till I heard my husband say that and smelled the chorizo. I couldn't eat after that and just hugged my boys. When I was 6 or 7, my mom dressed me up for Halloween as a powder puff girl, or that's what she called it. She put me in white thigh highs, a little short pink skirt, matching blouse, a pair of her old school shoes. She was having a blast, smoking meth while she dressed me up. She especially had fun putting makeup on me, mascara, lipstick, the works. She even made me wear a pair of white cotton panties. She made me take a couple hits off her meth pipe, then have a few sips of Jack Daniels, which almost made me throw up. Then we just sat there for a long time. I was getting antsy to go trick or treating even though I wasn't going to score much, not in the neighborhood where we lived. It was late when someone knocked on our motel room door. Mom let in an older man I had never seen before, and they whispered for a few minutes. They kept glancing over at me, the man licking his lips and grinning at me each time. After a few minutes my mom started gathering up some of her stuff and stuffing it in her shoulder bag. She grabbed me by the neck and told me I had better mind the man or else I said I would, and she let go of me. I didn't care who took me out for candy, as long as I got some. The man had been staring at me the whole time and his hand was shaking as he waved my mom out the door. She got halfway through when the whole front lit up with red and blue flashing lights. The parking lot of our motel blocked by several police cars and cops were walking up the walkway. Mom ducked inside just as the cops passed our room. They stopped next door and started banging on the door. The man got up and started freaking out, making my mom hold him back, doing her best to convince the man to stay, telling him to just keep me quiet however he needed. He declined and left a few minutes later. Mom whipped me with a belt for faking up her night and told me I wasn't getting any candy. Years later I realized she had been trying to pimp me out. It's more of its potential to be faked up, and I never realized it. I lived in an apartment complex from birth 9. There were basement apartments and upper apartments. Daddy Dean, what he liked to be called, lived in a basement apartment alone. He was very nice, always polite and let us apartment kids play/climb on his truck. He always had candy for us. If we ever tried to hug him, he would say no. He never got mad or impatient with us kids. He was also very clear that if we were going to talk to him when he got home, it had to be on ground level, never the stairs leading down to his apartment or anywhere near it. One day, an older girl and us were playing, and he beckoned us over, still ground floor where anyone can see us. He said he was moving. We honestly tried not to cry and begged him not to. He then asked if we wanted a surprise, and when we said yes, he disappeared inside of his apartment and came back with a black velvet display box that had little containers of what I now know are semi-precious jewels, colorful pretty stones. He told us we could pick one. Older girl picked what I think was a sapphire and I picked a ruby. He smiled and told us they were good choices and gave them to us. Told us we were very nice and sweet girls. He moved 2 days later. When my parents saw the ruby, they freaked out, demanding to know where I got it, who gave it to me. I told them Daddy Dean. They got pale. I explained everything but I don't know if they believed me or not. We never brought it up again. Well, it went missing, and I realized they freaking pawned it. Looking back, I really want to believe he was just a lonely guy who liked kids. None of the adults ever said anything about him being creepy, and of course I don't remember him being creepy. Oh boy, I have a wealth of those. Amazingly my childhood still ended up being pretty innocent. I was a pretty naive kid and didn't notice these things at the time. Years later, upon reflection, I realized how bad they really were. My mum had a friend whose 3 daughters were teenagers when I was about 3 to 4. They said they thought I was the cutest thing and often begged my mum to let them take me to the park and stuff. Innocent enough. They seemed like sweet girls at the time to my mum. Keep in mind that as horrible as a lot of these things are, they made sure that they took me somewhere genuinely kid friendly for the rest of the day so that I'd only recount the good stuff to my parents later. They'd coach me on what to tell my parents later too. Lots of our little secret, and that would be so cool of you, kiddo. Some of these could have happened on the same day. I'm not sure. Keep in mind I was very young. One time, they did take me to the park. Kind of. They took me to the part that didn't have rides, that just had a graffiti covered derelict building that stank of pee and had used needles everywhere. They went to meet up with one of their drug dealer boyfriends, which eventually ended up with the younger girl, 14, having a fight with another girl she caught with her boyfriend. Scratched the other girl's face really bad. Saw a bloodied screwdriver before someone covered my eyes, and definitely witnessed some inappropriate fondling. Still don't quite understand the situation. Another time, they took me to a newsagent. Left me to browse the magazines while they shoplifted. They got caught and kicked out. I ran out after them, frightened, and the shop owner knocked me over by accident. In the shouting match that was to follow, the middle girl managed to sneak around and yank down the jeans of the shopkeeper. He wasn't wearing underwear. First time I saw a penis. The girls knocked him over while tangled in his jeans, tightened his belt around his knees, and tried grabbing his dick, balls, as etc. while laughing. Basically physically and sexually assaulted the guy. Picked me up and ran away when they heard sirens. They took me to a house. Don't know where. Older adult male there seemed to own the place. Gave me a lighter to play with while he took one of the girls into another room to screw, which I only now know because I thought she was being hurt at the time due to her moaning. He gave her money and we all left. He grabbed me roughly as we were leaving to get his cheap plastic lighter back. I was sad because I thought I'd been given a sparky toy. To cheer me up, they took me to see horses at a local farm where I almost lost a finger while feeding them grass. They taught me some rhyme thing with a dance. Dance ended with me lifting my dress or shirt and thrusting. Had me perform this for their mostly male friends and for the previous dude at that house I mentioned. I showed my dad once and he was pissed. But I couldn't remember where I learned it from by then and he couldn't do anything. He had no idea these girls were taking me out at this point because he worked a 9 to 5 and didn't know I wasn't with my mum 24/7. They took me to a graveyard to meet some of their friends. Made me try beer. I hated it and cried. Got pissy with me when I wanted to go home and one of their friends poured beer on me and my nice yellow dress. The girls freaked out and took me home to bathe me so that my mum wouldn't smell it. Except their mum caught them and said they couldn't bathe a stranger's kid and to just put some perfume on me instead to cover up the smell. Sprayed me with so much perfume that I had an asthma attack and their mum had to call my mum. They made me tell my mum that I spilled the perfume on myself by accident. Threatened to tell her I'd been a naughty girl if I didn't. This was threat enough to 4-year-old me. My mum paid them for the spilled perfume. We were really poor at the time and I now know mum probably had to go without something to pay for that. I later told the truth. Have no idea what the outcome was, but I know a lot of adults stopped talking to each other over it. They took me to a random old dude's house to look at his budgies. Guy had about 30 birds, must have been breeding them. They gave me a cage, told me to pick a bird and take it home. My first pet. Mum was pissed. She's allergic and they knew this. They thought it would be funny. I had to give up the budgie. In a similar vein, they once brought a kitten to our house to give to me. My dad was allergic. They told me it was because he was mean and didn't want me to have a cat. Little me was so pissed at my dad for that. Turns out they were trying to sell it to my mum and they were pissed off because they couldn't get the money. The kitten already belonged to someone. They found it in a garden and were just trying to make money. Side note that I don't know which animal was given to my first. I have both distinct memories, but I'm not sure of the order. One might have been revenge for the other. took me on a bus to the city. They weren't supposed to take me out of the village. Nothing super terrible happened. Just took me to a market to look around and show me to people they knew. Mostly old ladies one of them worked with who thought I was cute. It was this event that tipped my mum off that they were doing things they shouldn't though, as a friend of hers saw them with me and told her. They lost interest in me around the time I started school. My mum didn't know how bad these girls were at the time until a couple years later when the oldest became a known prostitute and started taking hard drugs. She also had 2 babies, which were each taken away. I remember my mum telling me that if I ever see that girl or her sisters, I was to stay away and not let them take me anywhere. I was around 7 by then. Asked my mum about it when I was in my early 20s. Turns out that the first baby was taken from her for neglect, but she was caught trying to sell the second one after her boyfriend/pimp had been sexually abusing the infant. Did some prison time for it. The oldest tried to add me on Facebook a few weeks ago after finding me through my uncle. I was warned that she's trying to get someone to let her and her daughter live with them. Daughter is too young to be either of the 2 that were taken from her. Her 2 younger sisters seemed to have straightened out a bit and gotten jobs and families. But I know all 3 have been prostitutes at some point and 2 of them have been in prison. I was friends with this girl in kindergarten. I'll call her B. Welby and I love to play. We played hide and seek. The ground is lava, gymnastics, make believe. Normal 6-year-old girl things. For some reason B loved to play make believe with me. I usually loved it too, however B would force me to be the boy saving her from some impending danger. I always had to be the boy. She was very particular about that. I would beg her to please let me be the girl this time, but she would get really upset and cry, and me being a calm kid didn't like drama of any kind. I would give in instantly to 1 tear. After I would do my hero saving routine, B had another thing we specifically just had to do. We called it the pages roll. It was basically our legs in 2 V shapes with our feet together, and we would roll down a hill, or just in a straight line. Here's an example of our legs. No matter what, eventually after a few tumbles our legs would end up intertwined, and we would be really close together. It was whatever. I remember thinking it was kind of fun, but not when I would get hurt from one of her limbs smashing on mine, or when I would end up with her whole body on top of me. As a little kid it was annoying, but I didn't feel like anything was wrong. We would always end laughing hysterically. That is until one day B had a new idea for us. We were now going to take off all of our clothes and do the roll we had perfected. She kept pushing for us to just take off our clothes and do it. I mean, it wasn't necessarily wrong, I thought, but I really didn't want a naked body flying on top of mine, which I knew would happen. Well, yeah, I called my mom to pick me up. Because that wasn't happening, I didn't realize why I didn't like it, but I knew it was weird. B was nice, but I didn't want to pages roll with her anymore. Especially not naked. We never played outside of school after that. And yes, she turned out to be into girls. She had a stint of pulling her eyebrows out throughout middle and high school. She was a nice girl. I guess it just freaked me out being a 6-year-old. Not so bad, but something I feel like writing up. When I was in 1st grade, maybe 2nd, I was invited to a classmate's birthday party. I didn't know the girl, and in fact I really knew no one in the class. I was a year younger than everyone else, and was shy. We lived on a secluded road about a mile outside of town, so I never had any playmates, and had never gone over anyone's house before, not even cousins or even older relatives besides my grandmother on rare occasions. I had older siblings, and my experience there was that other children were dangerous, so I mostly kept to myself. So I was very reluctant to go. Actually, the way I remember it is that I heard you were supposed to bring a present, and I had none. So when my mother tried to drop me off, I resisted. She claimed that no one would notice, but I had never been to a party before, and felt that I would be called out for being empty-handed. That is my memory, but disputed. She claimed that the gift had nothing to do with it. I actually had not thought of this for 40 years, and then one day my mother used this as an proof that I was always a problem child. This is the part that fits in with the question, since I had never thought of this incident once in all those years. Once she brought it up though, well, what do you say? Now, understand that I went off to school and did other things. I understood that I had to do things. The problem wasn't that I refused to go or anything, but that I was crying and not acting happy on the drive over. I was ordered to stop crying, but couldn't. I was scared. She said I could not go if I was crying. So my mother cured my fear by taking me to an orphanage and giving me a choice, the party or the orphanage. Now there was one of those old Depression era state hospitals nearby that was now a mental hospital, the kind of setup with acres of rolling green lawn and trimmed shrubs, where you drive the long road past the red brick/white trimmed neoclassical outbuildings and the occasional group of mental patients tending to the flower beds and torturing cats, whatever. I still remember her taking me down the long road to the main building, all the way telling me she was done with me and I was now an orphan. That was it. Too timid to go to a stranger's party without a gift, so she really had no other choice. As she drove, she listed all the things that I would never see again. Of course, she had me begging for forgiveness and pleading for mercy in the end. I agreed to go to the party without a gift and like it. The funny bit is that she brought this up after all those years. I had completely forgotten about it, but she brought it up to support her argument that I was always a chore. She claimed that even when I was a kid she had to take me to the orphanage to keep me in line, otherwise I would not be obedient. This wasn't the only time, but it is the one that got her all the way up the drive to the big building with white columns and dark red doors. After that, she would just drive past and ask me if I was going to obey or if she had to turn in 6 years old, and she made it clear that my world, my life, was on a razor's edge. One mistake, or one unsuppressed sob, and I would be tossed in society's trash heap. That is what my life was worth to her and the family. Not faked up, just funny. My grandpa for a while worked at Six Flags Great America when I was 7 up until I was 10, and he loved his job. He was in charge of taking photographs and making sure guests were having a good time. My grandpa ran a tight ship, and it was honestly the happiest I had ever seen him. He was so proud every morning to get up, do his hair, make his lunch, and go to work. I saw him once during a trip with some other relatives. I didn't realize a lot of ladies in their late 20s and early 30s worked there until looking back on it. And grandpa was super popular with them. Like, every single lady I met there in that age range went, "Oh, your grandpa's name's granddaughter. He talks about you all the time." Now grandpa was loyal to my grandma until the very end. But I would not judge him if one of his job perks was having beautiful women fawn over him because he's a cute old man. Cause honestly, no matter what, he found my grandma the most beautiful woman in the world up until the very end. When I was 10 I came home from school and found my mom sleeping on the couch. I didn't really think anything of it. I went to my parents' room to watch TV. When my dad got home a few minutes later he was acting a little weird and told me to stay in their room. A little while later, the paramedics are taking my mom away, and there's a pair of police officers going through the house. They were looking at a bottle of Jack Daniels and a bottle of pills. I thought my mom was sick and the medicine wasn't enough. It wasn't until I was 16 that it hit me that she had tried to kill herself. She took a month's prescription of antidepressants and drank half the bottle. If my dad would have gotten home any later she would not be alive now. They were able to pump her stomach and save her. I've only talked to her once about it since I realized what happened. It has been next impossible for me to really be close with her since realizing what happened. My mom was my favorite person until I realized what happened. I'm now 23 and it has been extremely difficult trying to rebuild my relationship with her. All I think about sometimes when I'm with her is why wasn't I enough to live for? All the beatings my stepmother gave me for being bad. Later on I learned I did things kids do, but between the belt, extension cord, 2x4, whatever was close by, she would ground me for months on end and always find something new to keep me grounded, right before I was about to serve out her sentence. Early on when I was younger, she would make me stand in the corner for days on end. Force me to get up out Bark's bed, eat a bowl of cereal and just stand in the corner, face to the wall with my hands behind my back for weeks. I'm sure I broke a month before. In my teen years, she somehow justified stripping my walls and room bare with nothing but my clothes and my bed in my room. She would not let me read, write, draw, listen to music. Just nothing for weeks. When my family went out on the boat, she forced me to stay on the boat while everyone around me had a great time. And all of this is because I wouldn't bend to her will. I'm not 100% sure why she did this to us, save for the burden of caring for another woman's children, as she had two of her own when she married my father. She treated my stepsister the same. Her children, though, including my half brother, never seemed to find themselves grounded or wanting for anything. I still remember the first time she faked me up. I was 6. She called me in for dinner, and I didn't want to lose the salamanders I'd gathered, so I tried to sneak them by her. She made me show her what was in my hands. After I told her I don't have anything, realized I'd lied, and whipped my ass with the belt, and made me stand in the corner for 2 days. This is an average example of me being bad as a child. I never realized it was bad until I thought back on it as a grown-up. I've since confronted her about more than just this. She completely denied everything and acted appalled when I accused her of it and asked why she treated me like that. We didn't talk for about 6 months until I missed my father enough to eat my pride and visit, and ever since she's been overly nice to me, taking my side in arguments, stuff like that. I can never forgive her, and I'll never say I do for her sake, but I tolerate her company because I don't want to lose the ability to visit my father. He also denied a lot, and all of my siblings have stuck up for me. I know he enabled my stepmother, but I know my real mother, and she's been a raging heroin addict since before I was born, somehow still alive, but under the influence of every pharmaceutical narcotic she can get her hands on, and I have no desire to invite her into my life just to have a parent to go to when I miss my family. So in truth, I tolerate both of them and their lies, asking myself why the entire time, and I still don't know. TLDR at end. I don't know if this fits in as a faked up memory, and I forgot the post was about ones that you realize later were faked up, but I've already typed it all out now, and I hate it, and all this suicide talk on Reddit recently has brought it up. This happened back in 1998. My parents separated when I was young, and I was living with my dad at the time. Mum and my sister were interstate. I was on the phone to mum one night, as we normally did a couple of times a week. She had a few friends over for a bit of a drink, so she was extra happy and chatty. I remember having a great vibe, and the phone call lasted way longer than usual cause we were both just having a great time chatting. Spoke to my sister for a bit, then back to mum. 5 minutes later my sis interrupted and said she had to make a call. I remember getting annoyed at this because I was having such a great time chatting to mum. So I said to mum, "Tell Kat I hate her," just as a joke really, you know, as siblings often say, but don't actually mean it. So mum and I yell out, "Your brother/I hate you." We all had a giggle, and mum and I said our goodbyes. I was doing the schoolwork experience week at the time, where we all get placed into a business we wanted to work in. I was coming back from morning tea and saw dad in the foyer at the front desk. I thought that's a bit strange and walked up to him. I will never forget how frazzled he looked. Never ever seen him like that before. He just looked at me and said, "Catherine is dead," and started crying. Everything after that was a blur. He explained that she hanged herself in the early morning and mum found her dead. None of us were the same after that. Mum got really depressed and drank heaps. Mum was just a big kid, and her and sis were like best friends, always together. Sis brought her to all the parties, went out clubbing together, stuff like that. I went into my shell. Dad was strong though and kept functioning, even though you could see he was sad. It is horrible to see your parents sad. Mum always talked about Kat all the way up until she died 4 years ago. She always blamed herself, even though it wasn't her fault. Dad kept us all moving along with life, just being supportive. If he wasn't there, I think we all would have stopped living life and been so depressed. And I always think about my last words to her. "I hate you." I know she knows it was just a joke, but it still makes me feel like shit. And ever since dad died almost 5 years ago, when I feel like shit, he isn't there to help, and I feel so lonely and shit for weeks, and I can't help thinking that I'm also to blame cause of those words I said. I tell you what, if I didn't have a beautiful wife and 2 kids, then I wouldn't care if I was here or not. It doesn't matter how many friends you have, having no family left is the most loneliest feeling ever, and they just don't understand. Not sure why I'm telling you all this, not really relevant to the topic now I look at it, and so many paragraphs too, sorry. But maybe I just need to tell someone. TLDR, last words to my sister were I hate you, as a normal sibling joke / don't actually mean it, and she hanged herself the next day. I'm pretty sure my 5th grade teacher had slight pedophilic tendencies. Or at the very least, he wildly overestimated our maturity level. The thing that creeps me out the most looking back was how desperately I wanted his attention. I was a good kid and a good student. I didn't have many friends, so I helped the janitor pick up trash at lunch and spent recess picking flowers and giving them to whoever was on yard duty. I was always one of the teacher's favorites, and if I wasn't, I would work harder. So my little 10-year-old mind didn't understand why, no matter what I did, I was completely invisible, while the popular pretty girls got to sit at the table near his desk and were clearly favored. Even back then, I'm average looking at best. Anyways, he did a lot of things that just seemed weird to me at the time, even though I didn't know exactly how wrong they were. Here's a brief list. You know that there's a place in France where the naked ladies dance song? He would sing that over and over and over. At least twice every day he would sing, or hum it at some point. I told my mom about the aforementioned song. She told me it was disgusting. I went back to school, and when he sung it, I said that my mom said it was disgusting, and he went off on me about how I shouldn't be telling my parents about what happened in that class. It was a sort of snitches get stitches message mixed with a what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas vibe. Pretty sure his exactly words were something similar. Like, what happens in room 14 stays in room 14. I felt awful and guilty as hell for telling my mom, because I didn't like breaking rules. There's always sexual songs in pop culture, and kids who don't understand what it means will always love them. That's to be expected. What's not to be expected is the teacher going along with this and singing along and playing the songs that were just wrong on repeat. His favorites seemed to be Nothing on You and California Girls. For context, this was in California, and he was singing it to the girls. He would flirt with anything that moved. This isn't really inappropriate, just weird. He went on a rant at the beginning of the year, and a few times later on, about how he'd been accused of playing favorites. He warned us that saying that was the fastest way to piss him off, and insisted that he did not play favorites. Spoiler alert, he did. He also told us that if we brought him an apple or a cutesy sign or another typical teacher gift, he was throwing it in the trash. Which is just kind of a dick move. We had table groups, and as I mentioned in the long-winded backstory, he would seat people according to his preferences. The pretty girls sat in the table group near him. I always got placed closer to the door. Said pretty girls were almost like co-teachers. They helped make the seating charts and assigned partners for square dancing. Long story. They always abused this power, and since they hated me, I ended up square dancing some guy who'd smelled like Bo since 2nd grade and had no concept of personal hygiene. Seriously, he once sneezed into his hand and then offered it to me. He seemed to have an endless supply of toys and trinkets in his desk. Once every month he would clean out his desk, giving the pretty girls who sat near him a lot of little treats and gifts, while ignoring the rest of the classroom. He did have a few male favorites. He called them his wingmen. Unlike the girls, these were the few students that were somewhat helpful to him. One favorite was good with computers. Forget what the others were useful for. This was a long time ago. We opened our history workbooks 3 times that year maximum. He hated social studies, so he just didn't teach it. I later went on to be harassed in a different school because I hadn't learned the geography or basic information we were supposed to learn. Again, not really creepy, just faked up in a different way. He was the basketball coach, the girls' basketball coach, which isn't weird on its own, but combined with everything else on this list, it's concerning. As he was a basketball coach, and apparently a good one, based on the trophies he never shut up about, he would usually throw crumpled up papers across the room into the trash can, then make the students clean it up. One day he decided to switch it up, and threw the crumpled up paper at a girl's ass, with his wingman sitting by his side, instead. He then loudly proclaimed, "Damn it, I missed because your butt's too small." When I timidly said something about how you don't say that about a girl, he loudly retorted with, "What, do you want me to say she has a big butt?" I pretty quickly wimped out, because I was a faking coward who couldn't handle defying authority figures, no matter how faked up they were. This girl was 10, 11 at maximum. He had a barbecue and a fixation with hot dogs. He would make them every chance he got and would give them to his favorites, the pretty girls, first. One time the winds outside were so strong that they issued a tornado warning and told everyone to stay inside for lunch, which freaked everybody the fuck out because this is California. We don't get tornado ever. After a little while, he proclaims that if a tornado was going to happen, it would have already happened. No, the alert had not been lifted yet. So he goes outside and BBQs hot dogs in the middle of a faking tornado warning. He wouldn't give everybody hot dogs, even though he had like 3 12 packs and there were like 25 students in the class, saying it was only for the people who couldn't get lunch from the cafeteria. Okay, fine. He then proceeds to give a couple to the hot lunch kids, and then the rest go to the favorites. In 5th grade, everybody watched a puberty video. The girl's video was called "I Got It," and was about a mom making pancakes in the shape of ovaries and comparing the batter to menstrual blood. It was unnecessarily disturbing, and it was a year before I ate pancakes again, but that's besides the point. The point is that everybody knew about the video months before being shown it. And not because word got around. It was because, as a funny story, the teacher would talk about the time where, when presented with extra time at the end of the boys' sex ed class, he chose to play the girls' video with the hope that they would see something good. He then went on to talk about how the boys were grossed out. This was a funny anecdote that he would regularly reference. In the yearbook, there were 3 class pictures. One for boys, one for girls, and one co-ed. The teacher made a big deal about how the girls had to wear dresses and skirts, then would talk about how pretty they were, then as an afterthought, how all the boys should wear ties. Then when we got the yearbooks, I noticed, in the boy's picture, he had his arms crossed, looking goofy and like he was trying to seem tough. In the girl's photo he was standing behind them, and had his arms and face raised towards the sky in a sort of hallelujah pose. A few more things he did that weren't creepy as much as they just made him seem like a dick. He would regularly tell stories about his mom, sister, and any other woman in his life. Not a problem, except that he would use this nasally, whinny voice for every single woman in his stories. Even for his mother. This was a middle-aged man. During Women's History Month, we learned about historical women, and he would regularly make comments about how it was a man's world. My most clear memory of this was the librarian reading a story about the woman who invented bloomers. One of the lines was something along the lines of "Back then, men were in control of everything." He loudly went "yeah" and high-fived the nearest guy. He also told a story about how women were awful and makeup is deceptive, saying how he once went to his girlfriend's house early in the morning to take her to breakfast, then described in graphic detail exactly how hideous she was without her makeup. There's more. There's so much more. Like the keychain of a hula dancer with a grass skirt just barely covering her hoo-ha and hand cupping her boobs that he would show off. Or the talking Yoda he used as a co-teacher. Or the scrapbook I hand drew of that Yoda that he shoved into his drawer and forgot about until the next year. But I've already spent like 45 minutes typing this all out, and it's just going to be one of thousands of comments, and is so long it'll just be scrolled by anyways. But if anyone does read this and has questions, just comment or something and I'll elaborate. Oh, and here's the kicker. He can't be fired. He's tenured. And last time I checked, he is now the vice principal, and I can't submit a complaint to the school district without giving my own personal information and agreeing to meet with the teacher I'm complaining about. Mom denied me medical treatment. I had allergies and asthma from infancy, but she refused to have me treated pharmaceutically because she thought the inhalers would make me fat, and I have allergies too, and I don't need medicine, so why do you need it? Dad snuck me into a doctor the Friday before Memorial Day when I was 8.5 for inhalers. They would only refill the prescriptions every couple of months because they thought the instructions were bullshit. My life was one long moderate asthma attack until I was 17, when I had a catastrophic attack and took an ambulance ride to the ER, and my parents were forced to be more proactive. Mom backhanded me for asking permission to take showers at night instead of in the morning. When I sat down and cried I shock, she grabbed me by the ankle and dragged me to my room. She apologized a few hours later and thought that was good enough. Dad beat our ass whenever he was in a mood. Mom and dad would have screaming matches while we hid under the kitchen table. Then mom would storm out and stay away for several hours while dad went to their bedroom and left us to fend for ourselves. Dad was / a hoarder. This didn't help the asthma / allergy issue. We weren't allowed to have anyone over because of the mess. Mom cleaned once a year, usually the night before Christmas Eve. Mom deliberately neglected us. When we were in college, she said she wished she could have been closer to us when we were little, but she couldn't because she had to make sure we'd grown to be independent people. Joke's on her. My sister and I both have diagnosed abandonment issues and are severely codependent. Our babysitter was allowed to smoke around us. Again, asthma. Her oldest son, 6 months older than I, would lock my sister and me in his room with him and make us strip for him. Everyone thought he was my first boyfriend, but he was just my first molester. One of my first grade classmates used to hump me on the playground. I was afraid to tell anyone because 1. He said it was our secret. 2. My mom had beaten me a few weeks / a month prior, and I was scared to make her angry again. And 3. I had troubles with another student holding me down and looking down my clothes, and I got in trouble when I told a teacher. The kid who humped me was nice and stuff. He asked if I liked it, and I didn't want to hurt his feelings, so I said yes. I think he just thought it was something you do with someone you like. He wasn't malicious like the other boy. This memory makes me wonder what hump boy saw and if he was molested. Reflecting back makes me angry at my mom. I know I should have been a better daughter, so I didn't get beat, but that's not what happened. She likes to laugh about it and stuff now. She tries to get me to laugh with her and treats me like I'm stupid when I don't. She likes to yell at everyone else to be careful, but she neglected to think about her actions and the personage effect it would have on the pathetic, defenseless human that depended on her, and that the small, weak thing would no longer feel safe asking her for help. Mom is who I'm angriest at, and I don't think talking to her will help. She's not very receptive to anything besides praise for her immaculate mothering job. My mom used to dress me up like a skank, wearing short, skin-tight clothes she thought was cute, but I was so uncomfortable in. I would cry to get her to let me change, but she wouldn't have it. I was an introverted child who preferred to read than go out and play with the apartment kids, and once she grounded me from reading for the day, put me in a sports bra and shorts, and made me go outside and ride my skates alone. I was 9 or 10, and before I had any boobs I don't know she liked putting me in uncomfortable situations. I started to wonder if she was trying to get me raped. When I was 13 she let me streak my hair blonde for a band concert. I didn't realize it made me look older, but a lot of people commented on it. After the concert, with my hair done, and my mom having me in heavy makeup, this guy who worked at this taco place we frequented thought I was older and would flirt with me, even though I had no interest in the opposite sex quite yet. She would encourage it and never corrected the dude that I was only 13. Every time we ordered for pickup, she'd have me go in and pick up the food, even though I expressed that it was weird and I didn't like going in there. Same year, we were heavily involved in our local church, and it was the job of the older kids to make the younger ones feel welcome. One of the older guys was 16 to my 13, and he was just very friendly, and he was cute, but again, I had no time for boys, especially since that age difference was weird. Dude was a junior in high school, and I was still in middle school, but somehow my mom would tell me he liked me, and that I should let him know I was interested. My mom would brag that she lost her virginity when she was 12. I think she was disappointed that I wasn't following in her footsteps. When I was little I was unaware that my parents were on crack. They'd go into their bedroom and lock the door and leave me to my own devices for hours at a time. Every time I knocked on their door to ask for food, or if they were coming out soon, they'd reply with 10 minutes. and I'd wait and wait and wait. I didn't think anything was odd about their behavior. When I was 7, my brother's friend came over. He was 10. My brother wasn't home that day, but somehow this boy ended up sleeping over. I was on the top bunk, and he was on the bottom bunk. At some point he reached up and took one of my pillows, a pillow that was special to me. I got out of bed and asked him for it back, and he told me I could have it if I played truth or dare, but only dares. I agreed and thought nothing of it. His first dare was for me to take off all my clothes. After that he told me if I couldn't think of anything I could just say ditto. I didn't really know what was going on and just wanted my pillow to sleep, so every time he dared me I did it and then said ditto. I don't remember everything that I was asked, but I do remember at one point he told me to lick his butt, and since he wasn't looking I just licked my hand and touched his butt and he was convinced. That's the last thing I remember before searching the room for my nightgown and going back to bed. A few days later he walked by me on the street and said very quietly, "I'm sorry I was weird the other night." I waited over 10 years before I told my parents, because at first I wasn't sure what happened, and then after that I wasn't sure if what he did was a normal thing and thought I wasn't supposed to feel weird about it. When I was little, my mom would lock me in my room so she wouldn't have to deal with being awake or dealing with me. When I was slightly older, my piece of shit younger brother locked me in this shed that we would go into. It had a lock on the outside, and he locked me in there and didn't bother telling anyone. I was in there most of the day. I wasn't the sharpest kid, no doubt due to being locked away like the man in the iron mask, and it didn't dawn on me to scream or shout for help. Dad found me, and I explained. I'm pretty sure he beat the shit out of my brother for that one. I was also left alone in the house as a young 11 to 12 years old preteen with no contact info, pre-cell phone days, and no idea where anyone was. I was left forgotten for 2 weeks while everyone else was literally on vacation hanging out with other people or doing whatever. I learned to cook and ration my food, and I at least had internet. Lol. People came back and just said, "Oh Radley, when did you get back? I never left. You literally forgot about me." And my family wonders why I keep my personal life a goddamn secret from them. My sister blamed me when my dad cheated on me. I was only 7 years old and she was 10, and I had no idea what adultery was. Basically, my dad was the one who brought my lunch to school like any other parents, usually mothers. It got to a point where he got close to one of the mothers. It looked normal to me because dad is a friendly guy and gets along pretty well with other people. It wasn't weird to me at the time when we were hanging out at the house of my dad's mistress that one time. It wasn't weird to me when the three of us were just strolling around the department store because I was looking for a toy. It wasn't weird to me when the mistress was nice to me, like when she bought me snacks after school, because I think I was the friendliest among my siblings. It became weird to me when my mother started to ask me questions that mom ended up screaming at dad. It became weird to me when my sister was blaming me for the whole thing. She said she knew what cheating/adultery was, and she was blaming me for my ignorance. I was only 7 years old. It feels weird being reminded of these memories. Mom being in mental hospital because she was suicidal. Dad having mistress over while mom is in mental hospital. Me and little brother literally being locked in our bedroom while they partied. Dad and mistress on coke. Babysitter molesting me, ending up in foster care. Being handed my brother's bottle and told to wait while they bring him in. They never did. 30+ years later, still can't sleep in a car because of that whole experience. 5 was a rough age for me. Wish I could say it got better. Teen years were especially rough. Kicked back and forth between parents. Spent some time in a youth shelter. Mom kicked me out because I spent money I earned on school clothes. She needed it. Dad kicked me out because I got into a fight with one of his literal crack hoes. I could go on, but I'm sure you get the point. I've got my issues, that's for sure. But I have my own family now. Fantastic husband. My kids are told daily they are loved. There's food in the house. They have clean clothes, shoes that fit. Just working on believing I'm good enough. Family really sucks sometimes. I was eating cereal when there was a knock on the front door. My older brother's girlfriend answered and then went and got my brother. My brother was kinda whispering and then he pops his head back into the house and tells his girlfriend to bring me upstairs and show me his new blacklight posters in the dark. Since I loved those posters, I jumped up and went bouncing up the stairs with the girlfriend behind me. We sat up there and played for quite a while, or so it seemed. Later on in the day there was a flurry of activity around the house with my parents and other brothers. I hadn't noticed that my older brother was gone, and I hadn't seen him for hours. I was around 7 then and completely oblivious. Anyway, years later I found out what happened that day. The police were at the door that morning when the girlfriend answered, and my brother told me to go play in his room. My bro told the police his baby brother was in the room and he didn't want me to be scared by seeing the police arrest him, so he asked the cops to wait a minute while his girlfriend brought me upstairs. The arguing. My parents argued seldomly, and that was bad enough, but my grandparents lived upstairs, and pretty much their entire daily conversation was one big shouting match. It was never physically violent, but it would be things like, he would say something about how he just wanted some peace and quiet. She would reply loudly, and then he would defend himself loudly, and then it would get quiet, and she would resume daily life, as though nothing had happened, until it happened again maybe 20 minutes later. I learned as I got older, and did not require supervision, which was solely her responsibility, while my mom was at work, and I was not in school yet. I learned, at any rate, to dissociate from it, to go into a mental space where it was not happening. This was most likely the cause of the dissociative identity disorder which I was diagnosed with at age 15, since it started before I was born and just went on. Their behavior. I would stay downstairs and tune them out with loud music at times, but that would also get my grandma's attention, and she would often come downstairs demanding my attention, not giving me any time to mentally or physically be doing what I wanted to do, attention monopolizing. So if I stayed quiet and simply laid down and zoned out, that was my best recourse until I was old enough to leave the house alone. It sucks majorly, since later in life before they died, they both developed dementia and Alzheimer's. Each one had one of those. I really do not place blame on my grandfather. He was very agoraphobic. They both had very few friends outside of family and were home constantly after he retired. She never worked outside the home. Yet I can't bring myself to hate my grandmother. It's odd like that. They also had a son, my uncle, mom's brother, who showed symptoms of paranoia and, while he lived independently and worked full-time, would show up to get money from them very often and would oftentimes go into very rageful states at them. If they complained about his needing money, they always gave in, and the amounts that they gave him went into the tens of thousands. My mom really tried and was an awesome person, but she literally had to work over full-time hours. Once my parents divorced, and when I was a teen in school, before I got a job, or we would have all lost our home. My dad is still issueful because he is an alcoholic. Parents divorced when I was 12, and that in itself was actually a good event. I was relieved when it happened, because he would go off for days and then come slinking back guiltfully, and it would be a round of tension everywhere. My mom was one who bore her pain quietly, but you could feel it in the air. I'm still very close to my mom, and I do see my dad regularly, but the memories of my grandparents are not as unscathed as they could have been. 3 memories here. First, my father used to be the nicest guy in the world. Any lady that was broken down on the side of the road he would pull over to help, give them money for gas, and exchange numbers in case they needed anything else in the future. My mom was always with us, and I used to wonder why she was so upset about my dad being such a decent person. I later found out my father was a cheater, drunk, and drug abuser. The second was when we'd pick my dad up from visiting the horses on the farm. He'd always stumble out of the door, sometimes happy, sometimes really mad. We went for years, but I never saw any horses. I was always excited to see a horse and thought for sure one day I'd see one. Turns out it was a horse betting at OTB in New York. The third is the many unplanned and last-minute vacations. We'd go to Montauk, New York City, Washington, D.C., or anywhere within a reasonable driving distance. Every time we'd come back home a house would be ransacked or even worse. One time there was a giant hole in the wall to gain access. 2 out of the 10 plus times a dog was killed. My parents said it was because they accidentally got out while being taken care of. Later during my parents' divorce hearing, when I was 15, I learned that my father was in deep with the Russian mob in New York. Even then it didn't hit me. Finally in my mid-20s I realized what the hell actually happened. Bonus story, my father bought my brother a brand new BMW in the early 90s. My brother drove it for exactly 2 weeks before my father told him to just leave it at our family business and to ride home with us in the van. The next day we pulled in, and the car was blown up, still smoking, in the parking lot. Weird. I was at a pool party when I was about 10, 23 now, and this kid who was much bigger than me held me underwater near the point of drowning. Until about 6 months ago, I always remembered it as the kid just playing too rough and quitting once realized he was hurting me. I shared this with my dad, who was there with me, and his recollection was far different. He says that he too thought the kid was just playing around at first, but once came over to stop it. He made eye contact with the kid. He claims that he could immediately tell from the kid's face that he was intentionally drowning me and was getting pleasure from the whole thing. Once he realizes this, he picks the kid up and hurls him away, then pulls me onto the concrete. Of course this is when the kid's shitty parents decide to come over and scream at my dad for throwing their son around and not so subtlety inferring that they couldn't care less if the kid had drowned me. I don't remember this part because I was laying on the concrete coughing up water and trying not to black out. By this point my dad was just done with them and the whole situation and carries me to the car and leaves. In the car he tells me that he doesn't want me to get anywhere near the kid, but never told me exactly why, which is probably why I never connected any maliciousness to the situation. The prolonged lack of oxygen going to my brain probably had something to do with it too. So after my dad tells me all this, I decide to look the kid up and see what became of him. Turns out he is in jail for, you guessed it, murder. I don't really know the background of the murder that put him in jail, because this revelation freaked me the fuck out, and I had no desire for further research, but I don't think it's outrageous to say that my dad probably saved me from becoming this psychopath's first kill. My mother having several men over each night and they all would go to her room and lock the door only coming out so often, and I remember the open mouth look she had, and the smell of incense which bothers me to the day when I smell them. After a few years of this, I realized they were doing crack cocaine. This was the 90s, and they were having sex with multiple partners and even sharing needles. She eventually almost lost us kids, and she quit cold turkey and moved us away from the area and sheared all contact with those people. She found my stepfather and turned her life around, becoming a model parent. And now for the cruel fate of my story. Years later she got pregnant at 40, and after some tests she discovered she was HIV positive, and in fact my dad may have learned of his own positive status before hanging himself in our basement, of which I was the unfortunate one to discover him. To add even more salt to our grief wounds, my 15-year-old sister died a month later due to a rare liver disorder, so our very family had to put up with things I hope no one ever has to endure. To keep this from being a super sad only post, all of us children are HIV free, and she takes retrovirals and her numbers have been low, and she is the strongest person I know. We don't treat her any different, and she will probably live a long healthy life. We do try to keep it amongst our family though, because HIV causes extreme discomfort among those who are uniformed. Sorry for the long post. I have never talked about this on any open discussion. TLDR, mom was having crack and drug filled orgies and paid the price with HIV, but turned her life around. When I was 4 or 5 years of age, my dad loaded me into the car late one night and drove us the 15 minutes from our home in the country to a 24-hour gas station in town to purchase cigarettes. No big deal, except for the fact that my mother had done a fabulous job of hiding my dad's alcoholism from me. Looking back, I can now confidently say that he was drunk that night, carelessly speeding down dark, twisting back roads with his young daughter unsecured in the front seat. Thankfully, we reached the gas station in one piece. I asked my dad if he would buy me a treat inside, and he promised he would. I remember feeling immediately upset when he came back to the car seemingly empty-handed, no candy bar or ice cream cone in sight. I reminded him that he promised to get me something, and he assured me that he had. He packed his freshly purchased cigarettes and removed one from the box. He taught me how to properly hold it between two fingers and lit it for me. He instructed me on how to take a drag, getting irritated when I didn't inhale into my lungs correctly, even after attempting to 3 or 4 times. I told him I didn't think I liked it very much, and that he could finish the rest. He called me ungrateful, which made me feel bad. I thought he was lashing out, because I had hurt his feelings by not appreciating the gift he had bought for me. I don't know why this memory has stuck with me so clearly, but when it popped into my mind many years later I realized how faked up it was to give your kid a cigarette and try to teach them how to smoke. Not to mention the whole driving drunk without even bothering to put your kid in a booster seat, let alone fasten their seatbelt. There was also the time he asked me if I would like to go pick flowers to give to my mom. Of course I said yes. He took me to the local cemetery. We stole flowers people had purchased for their loved ones' graves. I feel like I should have known it was wrong, but I didn't. When mom found out where her beautiful bouquet of flowers had came from, she was so upset she cried. I didn't understand why at the time until, again, this memory popped back into my mind years later. My sister used to drag me to her room and play with my wiener. I got so used to it that I believed it was normal till way too old. She used to play games where I had to pretend to be her husband and get naked and get on top of her. That was my introduction to sex. I was 5. It kinda turned me into a faking predator, and I would try to convince my friends to play with me until I was about 8. Then I started to realize how faked up it is. I felt guilty about those actions since. I moved to another country when I was 9, and by the time I was 11 I met a friend who was a year younger, and I would sleep over at his house. I learned he had a older sister who was 4 years older than me. Over the course of 6 months I became very familiar with her. We became close friends. One day she took me out into the woods and built a tent, and we both climbed inside. She told me about a game she invented where we had took turns touching each other. Already being familiar with sexual stuff, I was all for it. But over time his actions became darker and more demanding. I told her I wanted to stop doing those things with her, and we never talked about again. I went to therapy about 4 years ago, and I was told little kids just do that. Thanks Steve. Super helpful. I was staying with a family friend while my parents were away for the week. I was 11 at the time, and the family friend had 2 daughters who was 2.5 years and like 7 years older than me. I used to go to school with the younger daughter, who had moved on to secondary, but obviously not the older one. Now I had seen this guy pass out at gatherings at one house or another, after drinking heavily anyway to the meat of it. The younger daughter suggests we play cops and robbers throughout the horse training complex she lived in. Since her dad was the caretaker, we had done this before. But eventually she was the robber, but she elected to catch me with some rope, tied my hands up in the stable we were in at the time, and then she strangely pulled down my pants, started playing with my penis, sucked on it a little, and then she was riding me, making a lot of noise. At which point her dad finds us, she screams and runs off, and he chases after her. While he's gone I manage to untie myself and stand up, pulling my pants back up, only to suddenly realize her dad has returned. All of a sudden I can't breathe, because I've just been sent flying by a punch to the gut, and I'm on my ass again. He punched me in the face twice, and then started slapping the shit out of me, at which point I was so out of it that I couldn't understand a thing he was saying to me. At some point the rest of the family arrives. The older daughter drove me to town to get checked up, and then we stayed in a motel for the rest of the week, while something happened back on the ranch. By the time my parents get back most of the swelling is gone, and I'm just left with bruises. At the time I just thought he was super drunk and beat the shit out of me because I didn't know any better. Instead I was sorta raped. If she had asked I probably would have said yes, but she didn't, and I had no real concept of sex as a country bumpkin at the time, and then had the shit kicked out of me for the fact. As a result of all this, our 2 families basically completely cut ties, and I only saw the girl again briefly about 4 times over the next decade. I heard things about the family. Not long after the incident the parents separated and he left to another state. The girl that had semi-raped me got pregnant at 16 and started popping out kids. It wasn't until I was 15 I even realized why he had beat the shit out of me. To this day I'm not sure how much the older daughter or the mother knew about what had happened before he started beating me. Later the younger daughter actually apologized to me saying that she had seen her sister faking her boyfriend and thought it looked like fun and had wanted to try it with me first because we had known each other so long, but wasn't sure I'd say yes. TLDR was semi-raped playing cops and robbers. Her dad found us and beat the shit out of me as a result. Didn't realize until years later what she had been doing prior to getting the hit and why the two were related. Kinda faked up my ability to be sexually active following that though, and probably explains a bunch of things about modern day me. My dad was an alcoholic, but come to find out many years later he was bipolar and treated his manic moods with alcohol, so sometimes he was a manic drunk who would stay up for days on end and terrorize his family, and other times he wouldn't leave the couch for months. In between both of these swings he was my dad, totally smart, funny and a great dad. It was kind of like living with 3 different people, 2 you hate and 1 you love fiercely. Anyway, in one of my earliest memories my father is first throwing me in the air and catching me, and I remember being terrified. Then he's throwing the grates from the gas stove at my family sitting in the living room, and finally him holding me above his head while I'm sitting in a rocking chair that we had and totally crying my eyes out. Come to find out this all happened in one night. My dad had been drinking for days and not sleeping and finally fell asleep. While asleep he did all of these things, and this culminated in my mother calling the police because she thought he was nuts. One minute he's asleep, next minute he's throwing the kids and household objects around. The police showed up and my dad woke to find them staring at him. He totally didn't remember anything he had done all night and was bewildered as why the police were at his house. My mother had to tell him what happened and what he did. Luckily, the broken stuff was there as evidence because he totally didn't believe her. My brother was a little older than me and my sister is a little younger, and I remember her in a crib, so I must have been about 3. My brother filled in part of this memory, but is amazed that I remember any of this because I was really young. This kind of stuff happened enough to where my childhood was kind of messed up. I just remember being afraid a lot of the time. Although not quite as messed up as some of these stories, some of my earliest memories are of my brother, a year and a half older than me, beating the crap out of me. Naturally, I would tell my mom. I thought she would protect me. Her response was always, "What did you do to deserve that?" At 8 years old I started being molested. By 9 rape was a regular occurrence, by kids, adults, whoever chose to take advantage just destroyed me. At age 42 I was in the midst of my 3rd divorce. Again, it was ending because of domestic violence. As I was trying to piece together how I kept landing in some really faked up relationships and situations, my mom's words hit me. I never deserved the rapes or beatings, but it had been ingrained that I was bad and deserved whatever happened. I felt so poorly about myself that I tolerated everything, hoping to find true love. I have spent the last 2 years healing, finding myself and dropping toxic people out of my life. I have tried dating. Finally, I can tell guys that I don't need their approval to be happy. I'd rather be alone and love myself than to change in a horrible attempt to be loved/destroyed. I was 7 or 8 when my mother and father worked nights/early mornings and left me and my younger brother in the care of our grandparents, who lived in a unit in our backyard. I'd get up at 5 AM for cartoons with Pop because I loved Pop. He was great. It's only in the last couple of years with the whole Me Too movement that I learned my grandfather being handsy, i.e. hands wandering where they should not go, as well as other choice actions I dare not repeat, was not an acceptable thing for an 8-year to experience. And it's not affected me well. Suffice to say, anytime I'm left alone in a dark room now, I go into fight/flight, and I'm very uncomfortable whenever I'm required to attend family functions he will be involved with. I've recently just learned we'll be meeting up with Nan and Pop in the return trip of our driving holiday. I'm less than thrilled. The general response from my family is to get over it. Apparently not saying anything about what occurred until years after the occurrence makes my argument invalid. My therapist, that they paid for, disagreed, but what do they care? I always know it was a dream and I don't remember too much, but crying and it just seemed weird. When I was about 3 maybe 5 my dad rescued me and my brother from this tweaker trailer my mom had us staying at. My mom has always been out of control junkie and putting us in fuck up situations our whole lives anyway she sorta kidnapped us. My dad drove down to Oregon with his friend Jay and Jay's dad so get us back. Mom wasn't at the trailer when he rescued us, and the some of the dudes staying at the trailer with us wouldn't open the door for my dad, so they broke the door down. Some people were nodded out on the floor and the trailer was filthy. So dad gets me, and some other guy was in the back room with my brother, and didn't want to give him back. So JS dad pistol whipped the guy and rips my brother out of his arms. Come to find out later my brother was locked in the back room a lot. I had no idea how horrible my mom was until 2 years ago. I always knew she was a bad parent, but I guess either my family really hated her or something so made her seem a lot worse. I'm 26 so it took my family a long time to tell me. I hate my mom and me, and my dad don't have a good relationship, but I'm just glad he's nothing like my sheep mom. On a happier note, my family are pot farmers, and when I was a child I used to help water the plants. I never thought anything of it until I was like 14 lol. That's when I realized growing hundreds of pot plants wasn't normal for everyone. When I was in 4th grade, probably around 9 or 10, I remember sitting on my bed in my room and eating out of a bag of chips. I was always a small kid, but I never really thought much of my size. I remember my dad walking into my room and standing in the doorway watching me eat. He then continued to tell me that I needed to start watching what I eat because I was getting fat and I looked awful. You know when you're a kid and you're kind of ignorant to certain things? Up until that exact moment I was completely unaware of my size and had never been self-conscious about how I looked. From that point on, I felt guilty after I ate anything. I remember being in middle school and crying and begging my mom not to make me go to school because I looked bad. Around the time I was in 8th grade I started starving myself. I wouldn't eat again until I felt like my stomach was completely flat. By the time high school came around, I was full on making myself throw up pretty frequently after meals and this continued into college. I finally realized that I had a serious problem during a particularly bad week of my sophomore year of college. I was stressed out and binge eating all week and would make myself throw up after everything that I ate. I had made myself throw up so much in just a couple of days that all of the stomach acid had burned my throat so bad I couldn't even talk and was in excruciating pain. My best friend and roommate at the time took care of me all week, going to the pharmacist for me, making me homemade chicken soup, checking on me in between classes. She of course just thought that I had strep the whole time, not realizing the real reason why my throat was in such bad condition. It wasn't until this past year that I really learned how to be healthy and realized that I'm really not as big as I feel sometimes. I've gotten better, but I hardly ever walk past a mirror without glancing at my stomach and trying to decide if I look fat or not. Keep in mind, I'm 5 foot and weigh about 125. I know it's irrational, but sometimes it's a thought that just won't go away. I still wonder to this day if my father ever knew how bad his words faked me up. I'm 23 now, and I still think of them often. My brother and I went on a car trip one day with my mother and a friend of hers. They were house sitting, and she needed to feed a dog, so we went over with her. I was maybe 4, my brother 6, and the place we were in had a ton of toys spread out. These kids obviously had money, in hindsight. Toys we'd only seen on TV. Stretch Armstrong. Only time I've seen one besides in vintage stores. Now, we played while my mother and her friend did whatever. With all the toys, we didn't initially realize that there wasn't any dog around. We asked but got a shrug about them probably taking the dog on vacation. In hindsight, they were most likely robbing the place. My mother had a drug problem, and so did her friend. But they had a ton of toys, so that was cool. Another was one time going on a trip with my mother. I was young, 2 or 3. It's my first memory of those pancakes from McDonald's. We stayed at a motel and went to a bank at one point, another motel. I don't recall how long it went on for, but apparently I was just tagging along for a breakdown. No one knew where she was or where she took me for days. I didn't realize that when I was 7 to 8, my dad was in rehab and we visited him for Christmas until I was in college. The rehab facility was called Michael's house, and I really just thought he was staying with a friend named Michael. In my kid brain, Michael was the best friend ever. BC he was rich enough to have a soda machine at his house. Not really a faked up memory, but one that I sorta spiraled over when all the pieces clicked. BC my dad is a very conservative pastor now, and it was a real wham bam realization of his past drug use, / edited for follow up memories / adding to the story. My dad still struggled to stay clean for a bit after this rehab visit, plus a few more times. In 6th grade, I was homesick one morning, but decided by lunch that I had a lot of work to do and wanted to go back. My sickness was mostly fake. My dad had been home all day in his room, which was locked. I knocked and he answered. He was sweaty and had this tone of voice that I have never heard before since, sorta hoarse and spassy. I said I needed to go to school. He got dressed, and when I got to school I told my mom, a teacher there, that he was in his room all day. I'm still not sure if he was trying to kill himself via rod or if it was just a drug spiral, but that really could have been a terrible day. As it is, he truly got clean after that day and you would never know talking to him now. This is the story that I should have initially posted. The memory was only triggered when I saw other comments about similar moments. When I was young and even into a teenager, there would be times where my mom would get really drunk and wrestle me to the ground and pin me between her legs. It could be because I was on my laptop at 9 PM or just because she felt like it. Another time my dad took me to an AFL game and then to hang out with his friends who he hadn't seen in years. My mom calls him up screaming that he's cheating and just in hysterics, saying to bring her daughter back. I tried to call her and calm her down. I'm probably 10 and she wouldn't answer the phone. I'm calling and no answer. So I freak out and call family members to see if they've heard from her. My dad didn't care because he was sick of her abuse and just wanted to hang out with his friends. Came home to find a half-eaten chicken, like a whole roasted chicken, in the front yard, the front door open, and my mom passed out naked with wine in her hand. When I was probably 5, my dad went to hang out with his very close friend, a father figure really, and while he was gone my mom told me he was a terrible person and hurting our family etc etc. So that when he got back I was sitting in her lap on the kitchen floor crying. Pretty much my whole life I have taken care of my drunk mom, taken abuse from her, and forgiven her for everything. She's done some pretty terrible shit. I thought nice moms were just things on TV. Or at the very least, that everyone had one bad parent. My dad has always been the best thing in my life. Saved me from her, even when she turned me against him, even when she kidnapped me to Oklahoma and brought a crackhead along for the ride, whom she faked in the same room as me, and I was about 7. Thank God for my dad, or who knows where I would be. Maybe I would be the carny faking hoe my mom called me because I told her she was an alcoholic. I was 14 and suicidal because of her actions and also being heavily bullied at school, so this cut extra deep. Also I was a virgin who had only had a boyfriend for like a day once in the 8th grade. Kinda too much to put in the words. I have a lot of examples. Here are a few. Some of these aren't even realizations, they're just faked up. The depression, when my cousin was displaying suicidal tendencies and began hurting herself. My aunt, who I have a really good relationship with, which is why this was so odd to me, told me I thought that you would be the one doing this, not my daughter. To me that basically meant your dad abandoned you, so you should been doing this, not my child. Okay. The molestation. This memory is hazy, but when I was younger my mom was busy with something, but I needed to take a shower. My uncle volunteered to help me shower. I thought this meant just make sure I use enough soap or something, but no, it was a shower together. I have a distinct image in my head from both of us sitting in the shower tub floor and he's grabbing my dick and I'm grabbing his. Thankfully this only happened one time. Or maybe I just don't remember / repressed the other times. There's no telling. The fight. My first fight was me fighting my uncle, the same one as above, mom's brother, at age 15 to protect my grandmother and mom. To this day I don't know what his deal was. I just had to step in cause nobody else would, and I could tell it was gonna get worse. Didn't think much of it at the time, but now it kinda haunts me cause he acts like it never happened. The post-mortem. In my culture, the oldest man of the family is supposed to bathe the body of the deceased and the family when they pass, before the funeral. First found out about this when the same uncle had to do this for his dad. I don't know about you guys, but when my mother passes, I think I'd go faking insane if I had to bathe her fac. The fighting PT too. I also have vague memories of my parents fighting etc. And one time I remember hearing lots of fighting, and then all of a sudden it went quiet, so I thought they were done. I went back into the living room and my father was choking my mother with such force that her face was turning shades and her feet were lifted off the ground. He stopped because he saw me staring in shock. Who knows if that faking trash man would stopped if I wasn't a witness. Much more. But it's 3:17 AM, and I'm too tired to unlock suppressed memories. Guess I'm not sleeping tonight. Edit. Thought of another. My mom would sometimes scold me, as you would, when a child isn't cooperating or doing the right thing, and it wasn't abusive or anything like that. My mom is an angel. But when I would find a pack of cigs in the car or some drugs, and ask what it was, my dad would never explain, and just say it's my friend's stuff. But don't tell mom, because she yells at you and I don't. It was bad enough he had me keep quiet on his behalf, but the faker had to try and turn me away from my mom like that too. Piece of shit. Haven't seen him in 13 years. He made it clear we aren't his first priority. My 5th grade teachers were probably having an affair with each other. We were in an advanced program that split the classes among the two of them, one for social studies and history, another math science. Both of them were married. Hell, the man had literally taken time off that year because his wife had a baby. But they were very oddly close with each other. One particularly candid girl loudly proclaimed during class that her mom thought they were having an affair, and the female teacher tried to explain that they were just friends. I believed her then. I don't now. At one point, during a game we were playing for her birthday, the male teacher literally gleefully slapped her on the ass in front of the entire class of 10 to 11-year-olds. This was after it was made clear to them that parents thought they were sleeping with each other. Quick reminder, his wife had literally just given birth to his daughter. They divorced their spouses around the same time several years ago. Then, just recently, they announced an engagement on Facebook without ever having been openly dating. I texted my best friend, who'd been in the class with me. She has some damage in her family life, so she seriously hates cheaters, and the male teacher was a little rude to her, so she really hates him, and we just talked about what a faked up situation it was in hindsight. When I was 9 I used to walk to school together with a girl from my class. She would come every morning to our door to pick me up. Then one day she came earlier and asked if she could eat breakfast with us. She was invited to join us, and I didn't think about it more, and neither did my mum. I think it was not that uncommon for kids to eat dinner at friends' house, so why not breakfast? But then, she started to do this more often, almost every morning. I remember my mum asking if they didn't have breakfast at home. Then, soon after this, I was visiting that friend after school, and it was weird. We couldn't have any snack because there was nothing on fridge, just beer. When we came there her mum wasn't home, only some guy. I asked if it was her stepfather, but she said she wasn't sure and thought it was some friend of her mother's. The whole home was also messy, but I just thought that it's cool she doesn't have to clean her room. Then her mother arrived and started to fight with the guy. When I later told about this to my mother, she asked me all sorts of strange questions that I don't remember anymore that well. I just remember I didn't understand why she asked. Then she went to visit my friend's mother to talk, and when she came back home she just told me that it's better if I meet my friend in our home, or we play outside, but not at her place. But we didn't play together that often anymore. She didn't walk to school with me, and at school she was distant. Once she told me that she hates me because me and my mum made it so that social workers will make her move away from her mother. I didn't understand at all what she meant and thought that she lied about my mum doing something, and we just stopped being friends. I wasn't even sad because I always thought she was strange and even little mean sometimes. She talked about things I didn't understand, how it's important to look sexy to get boyfriend, and how she wants to get older boyfriend soon, and I had many friends I rather played with tbh. When I think about this now I feel sad. Her mother was really young and probably didn't have resources to raise kid, and I hope they got help from social workers. Maybe she was able to stay with her mother, who knows, but in any case I hope she got breakfast at home. When I was about 6 or so, I began taking lessons in Taekwondo. My brother and I were super into Power Rangers and Dragon Ball Z, so we stuck with it. After about 2 years, I had gotten fairly good at sparring. However, since I was big for my age, I often pulled my punches so as not to hurt other kids. Even so, I was ranked one of the top 20 in my state. Now something to remember is that my father is a narcissist and an alcoholic, and he did not deal with my lack of title well. So, one day, he took me up to the pasture, we lived on a farm, and told me to try to hit him. I was confused, but I attempted to do so, obviously with no success. He would bet away every single one of my punches and kicks with ease, until he finally became frustrated enough to go on the offensive. His first real hit connected just behind my right ear. Until then I had always thought that seeing stars was something goofy for cartoons. It was not. The fight he had orchestrated quickly just turned into a 36-year-old man beating his 8-year-old daughter. One particularly hard blow to the chest knocked me to the ground, and I tried to crawl away, terrified and angry and humiliated. I heard him walk towards me, and in a moment of fear, I looked for something to throw. I was close to a fresh cow pie, and I scrambled to get to it. I turned and flung it, hoping to splatter it in his eyes, so I could just run and get away, but it missed and smeared down his work shirt. I froze. I was sure he was going to kill me. If he had beaten the hell out of me for no reason that I could see, he would end me for ruining his work shirt. Instead, he laughed like it was the funniest thing in the world. He was delighted that I had gotten angry enough to throw cow shit at him, because that was the point. He just wanted to make me angry. He took off the shirt, scooped me up like I was still small, and told me, as lovingly as I have ever heard him say anything, to remember this the next time I thought about letting one of those little beaches beat me. So, I became a menace when sparring. It seemed like in one summer half my division dropped out, just to avoid being in the ring with me. I became known as the Terminator and I received a state championship that year, all to avoid another trip up to the pasture with him. I was forbidden from telling my mother what happened, and because she was working insane hours, I think she only saw one of the bruises, which was quickly played off. I think I said I'd accidentally gotten hurt while playing, but was fine now. The next year she and my dad started getting a divorce, which was kind of a relief. It's been 20 years and I only realized how messed up this story was about a month ago. I mentioned the rough details to a coworker that I'm rather close to, and she said, "So, wait, your dad was physically abusive? How have you never said something before?" I just didn't know. When I was about 2.5 or 3 years old we lived with my grandma. It was just me, my mom, dad and her who lived in that small house. One day I wanted to go outside and play, as any 3-year-old would, but my grandma stopped me and held onto my arm telling me I wasn't allowed to go outside. This is when my mom stepped in and said that I was her son and that she was giving me permission to go outside and play. I vividly remember that after that my grandma pulled my mom's hair and that caused my mom to grab my grandma's hair and boom they were fighting. I didn't know any better and went outside and saw my dad on top of the van we used to have as he was giving it a wash. I forgot what I told him, but pretty much told him to go inside the house or something along those lines. He went in, and I waited about 15 seconds before I went in. But when I did I remember standing in the doorway and seeing my mom on the ground and my dad and grandma both kicking her. That's the last thing I remember. Then I remember being at a phone booth with my mom, and she was on the phone either with a women's center or the police, I can't remember, but we ended up in a women's center for a week I believe. I didn't think much of it growing up until I got to college. For whatever reason, that memory finally clicked that yeah, it was something faked up that I witnessed, and I blamed myself for a good while. I would think maybe, if I didn't want to go out and play, maybe if I hadn't told my dad to go inside the house, all these maybes faked with my head for a long while, and these thoughts and memory would be magnified tenfold when I would drink crying status. I went to counseling for it at my college's counseling services, and that's when talking about it to someone helped. He helped me realize it wasn't my fault, and that was a huge lift. That is the first memory that I remember in my life. I've made peace with myself though now. It doesn't affect me the way that it used to. Buddy and I, we must have been 10 or 11 years old, always played on the playground behind this old folks' place. One day, a man from that care home came over, and we chatted for a bit. We got to talk about PC games, and he came to mention he owned two of my most adored video games, Maximum Pain 1 and Far Cry 1. Sure enough, he invited both of us to drop by his place if we want to hang out to play video games. Gave us his buzzer number and we didn't hesitate much. The following day we went over and hung out playing gore video games in his apartment while dude was beside us on his mattress on the floor smoking. We found it weird that he was smoking from a 2L pop bottle and then zonk out for the rest of the evening with his eyes open. We took advantage of this time to go through his sheet and found tons of Bourne magazines and DVDs in his drawers. He also at one point had one of his friends come over and we all chit-chatted for a bit, and my buddy and I didn't think much of it, at least I didn't until my friend told his mom where we spent the day. We got told to stay away and we couldn't understand why. It wasn't until I was 19 or so that I realized how faked all of it cold gone. Just for some faking Maximum Pain man. When I was about 7, I tried to purposely injure myself in order to attain friends. I was bullied throughout school, mainly for being bookish and kind of weird. I was honestly so desperate for friends that I'd pretty much try anything. I noticed that whenever any classmate broke a bone, people would be really nice to them so they could sign a cast, and so they got to stay inside for lunch, as the injured child could pick someone for company and they could play board games inside, out of the cold. So, night after night, I would try to throw myself down the stairs. I would stand on the edge of the rail at the top of the stairs and try and get myself to let go of the part of the stairs I was holding onto. The bone I was aiming to break was my leg, because this would mean more people would be nice to me, so they could have a go on my crutches, and also so I could get out of sports for longer. I was bullied for being terrible at sports. I was a short, skinny, weak kid who had little hand-eye coordination. Thankfully, I never actually did it, but looking back, I feel horrified that I, as a young child, was so desperate for friends that I was willing to endure lasting damage. In the meantime, my imaginary friends had to suffice. The most ironic thing was that, when I eventually had a bad injury a few years later, it was at the hands of a popular, intimidating kid, so no one could care less. I know this is much less consequential than the other stories told, but I needed to get this off my chest as I have never told anyone about this before. My mother died when I was 2, and to take the pressure off of my dad, I spent a lot of time at my grandparents' house, so there were situations in which friends would come over when I was there. Once a friend, didn't hang very often with him, came over and we were in the garden, playing. At some point he told me that he had to go to the toilet. I told him that he could just go inside, but he declined and walked away. After a few minutes he came back and told me that he had to show me something. Beneath my grandparents' house is a vegetable garden and also some small buildings where they and the neighbors, which are also the landlords, store tools and stuff like that. There are paved paths to walk on. So we walk down this path and he stops at the corner of the small shack. There is an upside down pot next to the wall. He lifts it up and beneath it is a literal pile of sheet. This fucking guy sheet onto the brick path in my grandparents' garden and covered it up with a cooking pot that was used in the garden, probably to hold food for the chickens or seeds. I didn't really know how to handle the situation, and I never told anyone. Of course I was taken aback, but now this literal sheet is blowing my mind. Why? Just why? I can't wrap my mind around it. Also, I can't imagine the reaction of the person who found it. Either one of my grandparents or one of the neighbors. Oh, yeah, this was the last time I invited him over. Around the time Spy Kids came out, I was really obsessed with being a spy kid. Got all the toys and spy gadgets from Toys R Us and stuff, and my brother at the time, who I did not know was my brother, being so young and only seeing him on occasions as he lived with his dad, would play spy games with me. One of which included taking a hammer to my bedroom wall and making a hole in order to see into our mother's room. Why? I asked. Oh, because we could spy on her, he said. Oh, to see where she hides our Christmas presents and stuff? No, to watch her undress and have sex. Yee. 4 years old me didn't really know what to make of that. Thankfully the wall gave way and revealed another wall to hammer through, so he stopped. But that's one hell of an Oedipus complex he had going on, and the older I get the more I realize just how effed up a lot of my childhood experiences were. Mainly how effed up he was. When I was 8 years old, my mom took me and my little sister to a park. My mom was at the playground with my sister, and I went to play tennis by myself, using the green backboard thing, at the courts which were a few hundred yards away. While I was playing, a middle-aged man came up to the courts, started to use the backboard next to me, and also started asking me questions. The questions started off relatively normal, stuff like how long I had been playing tennis, etc. But it quickly grew into more personal stuff, like how old I was, where my parents were, where my dad worked. He even had me point out who my mom was over on the playground. As a kid, I knew all these questions seemed a bit weird, but was too naive to realize that he could have been dangerous. He finally invited me to come look at some tennis rackets or something in his car, to which I declined, because it sounded boring, not because I thought it was dangerous, and walked back over to my mom and sister. It wasn't until years later that I realized that the guy was probably trying to abduct me. Still haven't told my mom about it to spare her the heart attack. My mom had a friend when I was younger, and she had this little girl. They were both really good people, and I would always play with the little girl, and we would play Power Rangers, stuff like that. Well, one day this girl said a cuss word like shit or damn or something, and remember she was probably 6 or 7 because I was 5. Her mom overheard her saying all this stuff and came outside, ran around the trailer and jerked her up, saying, "What did I tell you was going to happen if you said another bad word?" I looked at my mom and she was just as confused. So the woman takes her in the bathroom and proceeds to wash her mouth out with soap and says, "You stay in there until you realize that you can't use bad words in this house," and slams the door. Well, just so happened 20 minutes goes by and this girl hasn't came back out, and I ask her mom, "When is she coming out?" And she goes to the bathroom door and yells, "Are you okay?" and no answer. So she tries to go in and the door is locked. So the mom proceeds to kick the door and yelling, "If you're in there just sitting and not opening this door, I'm going to whip your ass." Finally kicks the door down and the girl is blue from head to toe, slumped over. I don't know if the soap clogged her up throat and she couldn't breathe, or if she was allergic to it. I have no idea, but we had to call the ambulance. She's fine now, and she's a great girl who works out and goes to college, basically got her life together. But that moment scared me so bad. Anytime I hear a parent say, "I'm going to wash your mouth out with soap," I step in and tell them that story. This is pointless to post, but feels somewhat therapeutic, since I'm all caught up in these memories now. But I had this cousin who was about 3 years older than me that I had known since before I can remember. I considered him to be one of my best friends in the world and spent countless days with him. As we got older I saw him less, and when I did get to see him, he just wasn't the same. I started to dislike him, and I didn't really have a good reason why. When I was about 12 he made some sexual comments towards me over text, and I just remember sitting there looking at my little flip phone and slowly realizing that he had sexually assaulted me several times, and everything just clicked, and it was like a punch in the gut. I just remember pacing the hallway outside my mom's bedroom crying and wondering if I should tell her, then standing outside my sister's bedroom and thinking the same thing, and then the garage where my dad was, and I just couldn't do it. I was so scared and helpless, but so ashamed and confused I told him not to try and talk to me ever again, and things just got worse from there every time I saw him, until about age 16 was a nightmare. I never let him touch me again except for one time, when I was caught off guard at 16. We were in public at my job, and I thought I was safe but I wasn't. I've tried to forgive him, because he comes from a truly awful home, but I just can't, especially because of how disgusting his behavior is these days, and his whole family defends him relentlessly, and they send him to therapy occasionally, but I truly believe he needs to be in some sort of facility away from people. I've only told about 3 people this, but I've always tried to downplay it, because of some leftover shame I guess. And a little bit, because the first person I ever told didn't take it seriously at all, and basically ignored the whole situation. But now I'm in a downward spiral remembering all this, so yeah, thanks for the venting space, Reddit. My dad told me to change my dress, even though I was already dressed, and he was uncharacteristically cross with me when I objected. When I started to change, I saw a shadow and turned toward the window, where I could just see a head ducking down. I was terrified and ran screaming to find my dad, who was just coming around the house. He insisted there had been no one there. At the time, even though the top of the head looked very much like my dad's, it was incomprehensible to me that it could be him. Dads don't do that. I was used to people telling me I was imagining things that I wasn't imagining, and I knew no other adults would believe me, so I didn't tell anyone else other than other kids, who all took my word for it that it was a stranger. I couldn't figure out why my dad was so sure there was nobody, but I thought maybe it was just one of those things I didn't understand yet. I thought about it occasionally my whole life. I kid you not, I was about 55 when I suddenly thought about it as an adult would, not as I did as a child, and realized my dad had set me up to undress while he watched. My dad didn't come to my 9th birthday party. Compared to other stuff in my childhood, this event actually wasn't that bad, so I kind of tucked it away for most of my life. I remember my dad telling me he would definitely come and celebrate my birthday. He had even bought me this dress and said I should wear it for my birthday and he would come to see me in the dress. The night of my birthday, we had friends and family over. I put on the dress like my dad had asked, and I waited on the front step waiting for his car to pull up. My parents separated when I was 3. I lived with my mom. Let's just say my mom wasn't the most supportive person, and she kept coming over to say he's not coming. Come inside. Take that dress off. You look stupid. And my hopeful 9-year-old self would just reply, but he said he was coming. Eventually it got late enough, and I had to come to terms with the fact that he wasn't going to make it that night. I knew my mom would just yell at me and further remind me how stupid I was for thinking he would come, so I had to hold back whatever disappointment I felt in that moment. I had largely forgotten about that day until just a few months ago. I've tried to date, but I tend to get really bad anxiety and take that as some sort of sign I need to get away from the situation. There was one guy I dated for a bit, and he was always late. I would always get incredibly anxious while I would wait for him, because part of me just believed that was the day he wasn't going to show up. I would usually try to look nice on the dates and do my makeup and hair, and while I would wait I would hear this voice in my head, like he's not going to come, and you spend all this time on doing your makeup and hair and getting dressed up, and you just look stupid. One of those days, while I was anxiously waiting for my date to show up, that memory of my 9th birthday came flooding back, and I realized where that anxiety and where that voice in my head came from. I pictured my hopeful 9-year-old self sitting on that front step all dressed up, feeling her heart drop every time a car drove by that wasn't her dad's. It broke my heart thinking of that little girl and how often the adults in her life had let her down. I know compared to other stories in this thread, it's not terribly faked up, but it was surprising for me when I only recently realized how much that moment had actually affected me and how much it informed my expectations of men in general. Unfortunately, I'm part of a generation where ghosting is pretty normalized, and so my fears that one day someone will just fade away or stop responding are pretty valid. So this anxiety is something I contend with whenever I try to date, and I often hold myself back from developing feelings or getting invested until it's safe. I'm trying my best to overcome the fears I have and remind myself that all men aren't my father, but it's been kind of an uphill battle, and I'm taking it day by day. When I was 4, my house was raided by the police, based on a report, ended up being fake, by an ex-friend of my mother's. She accused my mom of being a meth cook. So I'm in the back of the house at like 5 AM in the middle of December, watching some old Disney Channel show about koala pilots, reading a Toys R Us Christmas catalog, and eating a Pop-Tart, when I hear the door get kicked in. Little me wasn't too worried, because my house had always been pretty loud and wild, as my dad did security for a rock band and they were around a lot, and my mom, while not a meth cook, was a pill junkie. So I hear the door get kicked in, and these beams of light coming down the hallway, and someone yelling, "Anyone back there?" So little buzzkill says I am, and the cops come back and see me and get a sort of sad look on their faces. They hold my hand and take me out to the living room. My dad is sitting at the table, angrily yelling at 3 other cops and one guy in a suit. Detective? I still don't really know, and my mother is on the couch in handcuffs, crying. They ask what I was watching, and I tell them, and they turn it on and sit me down on a chair across the room from my mom. One of them goes back and gets my Pop-Tart and catalog and tell me to stay there. I literally asked the girl across the street from me if that ever happened to her, because I was a little kid and didn't know that it was a really faked up experience. My parents to this day try to downplay it, saying that it's not a big deal and that it was a mistake. I'm 17 now, and I'm just now fully realizing the extent of shit my parents did when I was younger, and that my dad still does. It's disgusting. I've talked about this incident on a different Ask Reddit before, but once, when I was a kid, I was staying over at my cousin's with my older sister. My cousin's parents had just gotten divorced, and her dad, being fairly wealthy, moved to a house practically on the sand in Huntington Beach. The beach was literally a street away. So, my uncle, being trusting of my cousin and sister, and a cliché somewhat neglectful wealthy parent of an only child, let us go down to the beach on our own. I was about 9 or 10, I think, just starting to develop breasts. Early, I know. We had fun splashing in the waves, but since I was younger, I always ended up kind of left out. So, I decided to walk back up to the sand and sit on my towel. As I'm sitting on my towel, enjoying the sun, this older man, maybe 45, 50, walks up and starts chatting with me. At first, it's normal and he's just asking how my summer is going and what I'm doing by myself at the beach. I was a pretty faking dumb kid, so I didn't try to get out of Dodge or think that maybe I should be wary of this stranger. As the conversation goes on, he nods to my towel which said lifeguard on it with a big white cross, pulls down his sunglasses, looks me in the eye with a smirk, and says, "So, if I start drowning out there, are you gonna come give me mouth to mouth?" I somehow still was completely oblivious as to what he was getting at and just laughed and shook my head as if it was some kind of normal joke an adult would tell a child. Luckily, my sister and cousin came up right then and tugged me away while giving the guy death glares. It took me until high school age to even remember the event, but when I did, I was skeeved the fuck out what may have happened had the conversation been allowed to continue. When I was 4 years old and younger, my grandparents babysat me frequently, so I was at their house almost every day. One day I was playing in their living room alone, then got up to look for my grandpa for some reason that I can't remember. I found him in his bedroom. He was sitting on the bed holding the barrel of a handgun in his mouth. My memory cuts out there and comes back later. My dad was holding me still in my grandpa's armchair in the living room, and my mom, grandma, and aunt were in the dining room with my grandpa. My aunt was sobbing and she said, "Why don't you just go get that thing and shoot me?" I didn't think much about that memory at the time. It only really hit me how messed up it is when my mom commented on a home movie that I was converting to digital from VHS when I was a teenager. There he is with that glass. You mean that iced tea glass? That's not iced tea in that glass, it's liquor. For a good 2 years my grandpa was only around on Thanksgiving and Christmas. Once I started school and didn't need to be babysat so much, he was around more often. That, my mom's comment about his tea glass, and the memory of seeing him with the gun, makes me think that he must have been in a treatment place. He died of kidney failure when I was 14. When I was a kid, maybe 4 or 5, my mom would always let me drive on the dirt road to our house after she picked me up from school. This led to me having a very good grasp and confidence of driving, and for a child that couldn't reach the pedals, I was probably better at it than some adults. This is just to give you a little understanding on how the next part of the story was even possible. I don't remember the occasion, or exactly how old I was. I only know that it was warm enough to allow young me, my guess is 8, no older than 10, to wear a pink dress and a pair of white boots. I remember picking this very specific outfit to go to a party? A trip to a friend of my mom's? I don't know where we went or what we did, but at some point it was nighttime, pretty late, and it was time to go home. I remember being in the passenger seat of the car and then, for some reason, my mom stops the car after a few miles and says, "You're going to have to drive home." I know this wasn't a dream. Instances just as senseless or dreamlike have happened to me throughout my life, because my mom suffers from a rampant, untreated mental illness and almost none of my life up to that point was sensible or sane. That is the reason that no alarm bells went off in my child brain. I drove us home that night, a trip that was several miles in the dark. Young me was so excited to be able to help, and I got to drive on the real road. Our home at the time was in an incredibly rural area, so, at the very least, this was probably the safest scenario for this to happen. No traffic, no cops, automatic transmission, etc. My mom gave me directions, which indicates to me that she wasn't drunk or high. She just, I don't know why she did it. Maybe she had a nervous breakdown. Maybe it was lithium. Maybe she didn't realize someone had drugged her drink until she tried to drive home. This was before cell phones were very common, so we had no contact with anyone else until we got back to our house. I've never brought this up with my mom, but the more I think about it, the more I believe that I will the next time we talk. My experience isn't as dramatic as most here, but it's certainly more mysterious than I appreciate it to be. In elementary school I had a big buddy that mysteriously disappeared. At my school the little buddies were between grades 1 and 2, and the big buddies were around grade 5 to 7. When we first got paired up, I remember thinking he was the weird one I didn't want to get paired with, but I just chose not to care. He had a pudgier face and curly black hair. I don't have many memories of him, but the last memory I had was him taking me under the playground after school and trying to organize a time for me, or him, to come over. By the time I noticed him, my dad had found me and was standing nearby at this point and was trying to take me home. I told him everything about what my big buddy was saying whilst standing there, and my big buddy seemed embarrassed. I remember vividly my dad looking at him with a fixed expression, neutral, slight down curl to his lips, nodding and so on as my buddy began talking to him. After that I never saw my big buddy again, even when the rest of the class went to see their big buddies. Years later I have a sour feeling in my gut about it all, and my father denies all knowledge of this big buddy, even his name, which I still remember to the extent as to where we wrote it in our old phone book. In retrospect, I realize that the reason I can only remember how I felt, uncomfortable to say the least, and not what my big buddy said that day, was probably because I couldn't understand everything he was saying to me at my age. My cousins lived across the street from a private cemetery. My siblings and I used to go over to my cousin's house every weekend, and we would sometimes play hide and seek in the cemetery during the day. I can't exactly remember how old I was, but I would have been about 6 or 7 at the time. But one day, when we were playing hide and seek, my cousin, who was the oldest and a teenager at the time, yelled out really loud and had asked for all the cousins to get behind her and to stay behind her. I just remember standing behind her with one of my many other cousins while she was pleading to a guy to stay away from us. He had his pants down and he seemed shocked and afraid and kept telling her to keep quiet, but she was hysterically screaming. I remember that he kept apologizing, pulled his pants up and ran away. When I was about 16 that memory re-entered my mind, and through my curiosity I called my cousin and asked her about that day and what that guy was doing. She told me that he was hiding behind a big tombstone and masturbating whilst watching us play. I thank God that I didn't see him nor know what masturbating was at that time, cause I know that would have faked me up. I've never liked being touched much, and when I do I like to be asked. I hate hugs, to the point my friends will say I know you hate being hugged, but I really want to hug you right now, can I? And I'll let them, but I don't enjoy it. I believe the term is called tactile defensive, but I never knew why until my older sister pointed out that she knew exactly why I hated to be hugged, and once she brought it up I remembered it vividly and knew she was right. As a child, my dad's sister and her husband, Aunt D and Uncle B, demanded hugs and kisses, which I didn't want to give. And when I refused they would literally put me in a bear hug, holding my arms down, while I panicked and screamed and cried to be let go, and I would not be released until I said the magic words, which were, "I love you very much Aunt D/Uncle B," depending on who was holding me. No matter how much I cried, begged, pleaded, struggled, they would literally not let me go until I said those exact words, and sometimes they didn't believe me, and I'd have to convince them that I really did love them, still while being restrained physically. My mother said this never happened in front of her because she would have put a stop to it, but my sister and I remember it happening a lot, so clearly my father let it happen. If your kid doesn't want to hug kiss a relative, respect their decision. My situation is extreme, but hurting old Aunt Milda's feelings is preferable to teaching a child that anyone is owed access to their bodies if they don't want to give it, or an adult like me who hates being hugged and literally has to grit their teeth through every embrace. After my mom separated from my dad, she started dating our real estate agent who lived down the street from us once we moved. He was nice and great with kids. He played with the neighborhood kids all the time, and they loved him. He was especially close to the boy and girl who lived next door to me. One day my siblings and I go over to swim at his place, and once it's time to leave, he tells me to stay behind to show me something. So I do, while my siblings run along home. He brings me downstairs, sits me on the washer and starts to play a game. He licks my hair and blows in it, and then tells me to do it to him, which I do. Eventually I get weirded out. I was like 6 and want to leave because his basement creeped me out and I didn't like the game. So I get up and leave. I honestly thought it was a dream until I was a teenager and I told my mom about it. She told me it wasn't a dream after I was able to tell her specific things about his basement that I wouldn't have known unless I'd gone down there. Now I wonder if he ever did anything to other kids. We ran into him a couple years ago at a water park. He was with the girl who was my next door neighbor at the time, the one he was close to. They looked very close, but she was an adult by then. But I still got a creepy vibe from their interaction and wonder if he ever molested her. It seems very likely. To this day, I still can't stand anyone licking my ear or blowing in it. When I was a little girl around 3 or 4 I remember staying at my dad's house for the weekend. My parents were divorced and playing in the backyard with my brother and half siblings. They were all jumping on the trampoline while I was playing in one of those toy red and yellow toy cars. Well, I wanted to be on the trampoline with the big kids too, so I climbed up to join them. I don't remember what happened, but the next thing I knew, I was in excruciating pain and I couldn't stand. I had to crawl down from the trampoline to inside on all 4s because nobody would help me and I couldn't walk. When I got inside my dad yelled at me for getting on the trampoline, wrapped up my ankles, and tried to play it off as a sprain. I couldn't walk or stand for the rest of the day and he kept berating me saying things like, "You're fine, stop being such a cribby and get up." When my mom came to pick me up, I thought she would yell at me too. To my surprise it was my dad who got the earful. And she was pissed. She took me to a real hospital like a responsible adult, and we found out the ankle was completely broken. I had to wear a hard cast for months. I felt so guilty at the time, but looking back it was 100% my dad's fault. Apparently what happened was he threw all us kids outside, then went inside to get drunk and or high and left us alone for hours. He had a history of being neglectful. When I was even younger I became severely dehydrated in his care and had to get a catheter put in at the hospital. Later found out he was also molesting my older sister. I haven't seen the post since I was 10ish, thank God. When I was 8, I was cycling around the neighborhood with my friend, and we used to help look after younger kids, to help the parents out a bit. We were helping look after a 3-year-old when this man came up and was hanging out with the boy's mum. He talked to me and my friend a bit and eventually asked if we wanted to go for a walk up the lane with him. This lane was relatively nearby. It was always relatively quiet with not many houses near there. My friend and I said no, saying we probably wouldn't be allowed, and cycled away. I remember feeling a little uneasy because I couldn't go home as my parents had gone out and I didn't have a key, so I kept cycling around until they got home. I didn't tell my parents until the next morning when I saw the man walk past our house and I started freaking out, though I didn't fully understand why. My parents called the police after I told them what had happened and didn't tell me much about the situation, so it was a long time before I really understood. A few years later, I was told that the man was known to the police as a pedophile who had previously raped his own daughter, and I recently got told that the police spoke to him that morning and apparently searched him and found that he had rope and tape in his bag. I'm glad that my friend and I both instinctively felt weirded out around him and didn't go for that walk with him. When I was younger I used to be terrified of storms. When I saw terrified I mean like hide in my room and sometimes cry. Backstory on that, there was a tornado in Ohio where I lived at the time, and I woke up to tornado sirens, strong winds, and heavy rain. I was about 4 to 5 years old at the time and I went to go to my mum's room to wake her up because I was terrified. While in the hallway a flash of lighting illuminated a dark figure in the hallway. I was absolutely terrified. So I think from then on I associated storms with scary dark figure plus sirens and all that jazz. Sorry for the long background info. So anyways, a few years later at the time we were in Georgia near Fort Benning. Stepfather was a military hard-ass. And there was a hurricane south of us which was causing a lot of tornado clusters around the area. So lots of sirens plus lightning and all that other jazz. I guess I was being scared or something, and my stepdad said that's it, I can't take this shit anymore, and proceeded to throw me outside with a tornado close by. And said you're not coming back in until you aren't scared. I was out there for 20 minutes. I was soaked and shivering, but I wasn't crying anymore or freaking out. The ironic part is that I love storms now. So it ended up working out okay. It's just the way that the situation went down that is faked up. P.S. I have plenty of more stories to share from Harder's stepdad if anyone else wants to hear it. Once, my sister, my mom and I were at my grandma's house. My sister and I were young, maybe 4 and 6. We were all about to go on a road trip, so my mom and my grandma were packing the car. My sister and I were playing in the front yard. When my mom and grandma weren't paying attention, my grandma's neighbor came over to me and my sister. She said, "Come on, come with me." We had met this lady once before, so we took her outstretched hands and went into her house. She brought us into her kitchen, offered us chocolate, and then introduced us to an old lady. I remember feeling weird, but comforted by the offering of candy. Next thing I know, my mom is banging on the door. The neighbor lady answered. My mom saw us, and she took us back very forcefully. She screamed at me and my sister that we do not talk to strangers or go with anyone anywhere, no matter what. A weird memory. I have never spoken with my mom or my sister about it. Kinda don't want to. When I was 6, I was dating my brother's best friend at the time, Lucas. Lucas and I played together a lot. Every time he came over to play with my brother, he'd ask me to meet him in my parents' closet. Being 6 years old, I thought nothing of it and assumed it was a secret hideout. Two things that I remember distinctly is being put to bed one night and telling my mom me and Lucas jumped. She stopped dead in her tracks as she was about to walk out the door and asked me what I had just said. Because of her tone, I was afraid I'd done something bad and I'd get in trouble. Not that I knew that humping was anything other than a game Lucas and I played. I told her I didn't say anything, and she never bothered to ask how her 6-year-old daughter knew what humping was. Another time, and ultimately what ended the contact between he and I, was the day he and I met in the closet again, saying he wanted to show me something and taking his penis out. I told him I wanted to leave. He begged me to stay, but I got out of the closet and went into my room or outside or something. I never spoke of it again. Not sure how long it went on for. I know there were numerous occasions, and we never got caught. The whole time this was going on, I was agreeing to do it out of curiosity, and because he agreed to play Polly Pockets with me afterwards. My mom wrote off our extended time together as him crushing on me. I think I'll tell my mom someday, just so she knows. When I was probably 9 or 10, I was at a friend's house. We were sitting on her trampoline in the backyard, and her dad was standing at the grill on the other side of the yard just out of earshot for regular conversations. She started talking about the person who had moved in across the street from her, and how creepy he was. In that I need to have a story to impress you kind of kid voice, she tells me that he raped a 7-year-old. I never looked into this house specifically, but our neighborhood had a relatively high number of such offenders in and around it, so she could very well have been right. Anyway, I didn't know what that meant at the time, and I called her bluff by simply asking what does rape mean. She sat there for a second before admitting she didn't know. Then, she yells for her dad, who looks over at us to hear his daughter yell across the yard, "What does rape mean?" Her dad just kind of stared for a moment before muttering, "You don't need to know about that," and returning to his grilling. Of course at the time I didn't get why he was so weird about it. Now I not only realize how upsetting it probably was for him to hear his young daughter ask about it, but I also laugh when I think about how ridiculous and out of the blue that question was. When I was in first grade, somebody dared me to sit in another person's seat on the bus. We had assigned seats. The person who normally sat there tried to push me out, and I was pushing back. Sooner or later, the kid who dared me shoved me a bit into the seat. I didn't realize he shoved me until years later, and I started to fall backwards. I was pushing backwards against the person in the seat, whom was using her feet to push me. When I fell backwards, the back of my head hit the corner of the heater on the bus. I must have passed out, since when I woke up, I felt something wet on my hand. At first, I thought it was just water somebody spilled, but when I looked at my hand, it was blood covered. I was able to stand up, and that's when the bus driver finally noticed me. She stopped on the side of the road, cleaned up all the blood on my head, and quickly drove me home. My parents, who were poor, decided not to take me to the hospital, but instead shaved my head and cleaned out the wound themselves. So, it took me a little while to realize that it was kind of messed up that they didn't take me to the hospital, but I didn't realize until way later that what was more messed up was that not a single kid told the bus driver that I was on the floor bleeding out. It finally took me standing up and crying for the bus driver to notice. TLDR, I nearly bled to death because people on my school bus wouldn't tell the driver that I was bleeding out. My mother cutting my hair as a child to a short haircut, something I don't remember asking for, but my mother kept doing anyway. I was a teenager before I demanded she stop doing that. Now, my mother was a hairdresser, so it's not like she was doing anything particularly wrong, but the things it caused were ultimately very faked up. I have thick, coarse, curly hair that needs constant trimming to keep it from becoming unruly. My sister, on the other hand, had nice, normal straight hair, and my mother would dutifully style sister's hair every single day. It was one of the very many ways that my mother avoided teaching me how to be a girl. It, of course, didn't help that the kids at school would tell me my hair made me look like a boy either. My parents also spent a great deal of my adolescence trying to figure out how to get me to tell them I'm gay. I'm not gay. Thanks, Mom and Dad. When I was but a tiny ignorant child, I practically raised myself. My dad was always working, and my mom was always taking care of my sister who is paralyzed from the waist down and hooked onto machines to stay alive. To give the short version of that story, I would always stay in my room and play with my Hot Wheels on my cool little rug thing that had the roads and buildings on it. I remember every now and then when I'd leave my room to see what the family was doing, the house would smell really bad, and I'd see these plastic tube things on the counters. Whenever I'd try to talk to my parents about getting some food or literally just talking to them about anything, they wouldn't respond. My mother would stand in the middle of the hallway pacing back and forth, phone in hand, just pressing random buttons and kinda panting like a dog almost. My dad was always in the bedroom, and I was always denied access in there, but whenever I would see him, I'd see what I believed was him playing with fire and plastic while messing with these weird looking rocks. As a kid I always thought rocks were cool, which is also why I have nerve damage in my hands, by thinking the cool white and red glowy rock under the BBQ pit was a good thing to pick up. Anyways, long story slightly not as long, my parents were frequent users of crack and would cause them to neglect their children, and is also the cause of my sister's disability. My mother doesn't know. I remember everything, and I know why my sister is how she is. She ruined an innocent girl's life from her pathetic addiction and now reaps the benefits of free money from the government. It's disgusting, and she will never be forgiven for her incompetence. Mine is not even in the same league of faked up as all of the other comments, but I'll give it a try anyway. In the county that I live in, along with rings, it's customary for married women to wear a specific type of necklace, ultimate symbol of married life, and is generally gifted to them by their husbands, representing their bond or love or some shit like that. When I was around 9, we had a substitute filling in for one of our regulars for a day. The sub decided we were ahead of schedule in regards of the syllabus anyway, so she said she'd give us the lecture off, just sit inside the classroom and do whatever we wanted, as long as we didn't disturb others. Anyway, we all got to doing our own stuff, and the sub went around the class checking on us once in a while. After she was convinced everything was in order, she just kept pacing back and forth in front of us. She was pretty young, say around 20 to 23 or so, but she was married. I could see her wearing the necklace. After a while, she starts fiddling and playing with the necklace while smiling to herself and biting her lips. None of us give it too much thought, but as time passed she started pacing around faster. The fiddling gets more and more intense, and her face is now visibly red. She keeps pacing around at an almost feverish speed, and at this point she's practically yanking in the necklace. Her face is now the color of a cherry and she's shaking below the hips, as if she needs to go pee really bad. She then proceeds to lift the pendant up to her lips and kiss it for 3 full seconds. After this she stops pacing and sits down in a chair, looking as if she just ran up 4 flights of stairs. For the remainder of the lecture, which was barely around 2 to 3 minutes, she sits with her head thrown back and her eyes closed, with a hint of a smile on her face. As 9-year-old, my entire class was completely confused about what the fuck just happened. None of us asked her anything. I know it doesn't sound very bad, but I'll never forget the expression of pure satisfaction on her face. TLDR, when I was in middle school, one of my teachers orgasmed in the middle of class in front of all the students. Not really a childhood memory as it happened only 2 years ago, but I was 15 at the time it happened, so I was still pretty young. For context, it happened in a huge mall parking lot. So basically me and 2 of my friends, all of us girls, were walking to my one friend's mother's car, and while we were walking, my one friend starts freaking out a bit. She mentioned something about the weird guy with a phone in the car that was trailing us very slowly. We were squished over on one half of the road so people could pass, and he was just following like 10 feet behind us. Me, my other friend, and her all look behind us at the same time, and we see this older guy just lean back into his car, put away the phone he'd been filming us with, and watch him speed away at like 30 miles per hour when he'd very clearly just been going around 5. Naturally, my one friend flips shit and the other tells her mom, who was a few feet in front of us and digging through her purse for her car keys, while I'm just mildly amused at worst. I found it funnier than they both did, and looking back on it my reaction was a bit off lol. I remember just thinking that it was just funny and not being rightfully freaked out like they were. I'm a bit late here, but when I was 12, naive 12-year-old, I went to Egypt on a family holiday and really wanted one of those emo desert scarves that everyone was wearing back home. So I told my parents I was going to look down on the beach market, somewhere in Hurghada. They told me to be careful, but thinking I was so grown up I walked into the first stall I saw, and there was a 5-feet-old man with a full-on white beard and long beige robes, so I felt safe buying from him. I picked up a B/W1 and asked how much. He said he would help me put it on before I bought it. I said I was hot enough so didn't want to wear it right now, but he insisted. I just thought he was trying to be helpful. He went behind me and started putting the scarf on. He was very close to me, but I thought maybe he had to be. He also seemed to take ages to tie it, but then he literally pressed his whole body and bulge against me. Then he held my waist and turned me around. I didn't feel comfortable anymore, so broke away from him and put my entire holiday money, about £30, on his little table and walked away with the scarf on. At the time I had no idea what had happened and was more frustrated about having to tell my parents I dropped the cash. They were furious with me, and rightly so. I wasn't allowed out of their sight for the remaining 10 days. After my parents divorced my dad and I started hanging out more, I was 15, angsty, and wanted to act older than I really was, especially because my mom had sheltered us so much. I knew a lot about her history and understood why my parents were divorcing from my dad's perspective, so I sided with him in most of the disagreements. She has PTSD. She grew up in a cult, raped and abused by her dad and brother from 4 years, 18 when she left and met my dad a couple years later. She was also really open about the events, describing specific ones in detail, which is also something faked up I didn't realize until recently. I'm 25 now. When I moved in with my dad it seemed more like a roommate situation than parent-child. He commuting MF for work, but when he came home on the weekend we'd go out for dinner and a movie. I was his wingman, and pretty enthusiastic about it. It was how we bonded. I helped him pick out lingerie, he'd tell me he got laid, and we'd high five. We'd scope the perimeter for hot chicks. A few times he asked me to set him up with my 18 to 20-year-old friends, but I took it as a joke, still being in high school and him being my dad. But the weirdest aspect of our relationship was that when we would go out he would always anticipate someone thinking I was his girlfriend/wife. According to my mom, he used to say if they ever divorced I would just become his little wife while I was in middle school. He didn't do a lot of PDA or anything. It's weird just to hug for both of us, but we'd go to an upscale restaurant/bar and we would mingle with other adults. I'd be dressed like Pretty Woman because teenagers have bad taste in fashion, and I'd been conditioned to think her wear was casual. Booty shoes, platform heels, hair extensions, low-cut shirts and tons of makeup. Now that I'm engaged and preparing to start my own family I'm disgusted with his behavior. I've learned about some of his history that led him to be very open about his sexuality, but it doesn't really take away the weirdness or responsibility for common sense when it came to raising a daughter. My sister and I used to play a game called Angeland, where we'd be different characters whom we'd create and develop as time went on. It literally went on 4 years. When I was about 8 and she was 12, she created a character named John, who she said was my boyfriend. We shared a room and had bunk beds, and she'd often join me on mine, just playing with our stuffed animals and whatnot. But with John she'd encourage me, as him, to get under the covers, where she'd then proceed to kiss me all over my face. I enjoyed that. It felt nice, and it was affection from my sister, which I rarely got. You know what it's like. I was the younger sibling she hated a lot of the time, whereas I worshipped her. After a while, she started saying that she, John, wanted to kiss me. I didn't really think it was a problem, and he was so reassuring that I'd like it that I agreed. She'd kiss me, then she'd say we should touch tongues, because that's what people who love each other do. I didn't really want to do that, but she was persuasive, and I wanted her to enjoy playing with me, so I did it. Didn't like it. It felt weird and disgusting to me. She laughed and said I would grow to like it. She also made me touch her in an obvious place, as well as fondle her breasts. I didn't really like that either. She asked me if I wanted her to touch me, and I said no. I can't remember if she did or not. This went on for a while. I was extremely gullible as a child, very much wanted her to love/like me, and, though it made me uncomfortable, I didn't realize there was anything really wrong with it. I realized that this is probably quite common, and that many siblings have probably had similar experiences in discovering themselves, using their siblings to understand intimacy. I also know that my sister experienced some level of abuse, though not sure how much, via another family member, which she admitted to me through an email. I never held it against her, even once I realized as a teenager what she'd done and encouraged. She's my best friend, and we are incredibly close. I do, however, think that it's affected me in some way in my trust vis-a-vis sex and intimacy, that, as well as being sexually assaulted when I was 12. Anyway, it hit me quite hard when I realized what had happened. Still, no hard feelings. My grandparents in Puerto Rico had an elderly friend from their church who lived in a shack on their property for free. They even gave him food, but I never saw the guy ever, and sometimes my grandmother was on the phone for what felt like hours waiting to talk to people about him. Well, their neighbor had a fence and coconut trees that went right up against the shack, and I was over often to play with their daughter who was about my age. One day we decided to climb the fence. We were always told not to go near that area and look into the shack to see this guy my grandparents housed. We did manage to look into the shack and saw the guy sleeping on a bed, naked, and really huge lumpy balls, like the size of grapefruits. We just stared at him for a minute and agreed that he was boring and climbed back down. Soon as we climbed back down, a coconut missed my friend's head by an inch and landed at her feet. We were so excited and took it inside to open. Later on I heard that he didn't live in the shack anymore, and when I asked I was just told that he was in peace now. When I was much older, I thought back to that and realized that the guy was homeless, really sick, considering whatever was happening to his balls, and that my grandmother had been trying to get him help or whatever from hospitals or social services, whoever she was waiting on the phone forever for. PR's economy was well on the decline by then, and a lot of welfare programs and other public services were barely scraping by, if even functional. My grandparents apparently took care of him until his death. I also realized just how close I came to witnessing my friend die. We hadn't given any thought to the fallen coconut, just oh look, a coconut. When I was 5 or 6, my step-siblings and I would spend a lot of time roaming the woods around our house. Fed up with all of the trash the older kids were leaving in our woods, we decided to set traps for them, including badly camouflaged shallow pits with unsharpened tree branch stakes and shards of glass complete with trip lines across the trail. I'm pretty sure we didn't succeed in murdering anyone, but when I was 8 or 10 my slightly older cousin and I went away to summer camp. One night after dark, but before lights out, some of the other kids in our cabin were chatting with the counselor, some 18 years douchebag, and one of them wound up asking about pubic hair, specifically the counselor's, at which point he stood up, dropped his shorts, and insisted everyone take a long look before he'd put his clothes back on. When we were slightly older, we were visiting my neighbors, who were building a fort of sorts from fallen branches and logs. One of the older kids decided the fort required unrotted wood for structural integrity and set off with an axe to fell some trees. This upset me a great deal for some reason, and my cousin wound up threatening that kid with an axe until he agreed to not cut down any trees. Later that week, my cousin wound up cornering our babysitter and demanding to see her breasts before he'd let her leave. She never babysat for my parents again. I actually had a best friend when I was a little kid and we did everything together. So this takes place when I was around 4 or 5 years old and she was 2 years older and we were playing with toys. And all of a sudden she doesn't want to play anymore. I begged her to keep on going with me and she went okay, but on one condition. She basically wanted me to show her my little kid Johnny that I had between me. I don't remember if I ended up showing her or not. All I remember is trying to dodge the request out of embarrassment and coming up with excuses to not do it. I guess my brain is trying to block that out. What I do remember though is that sometime during that I got my first kiss. And to be honest, I actually did have a crush on her as a kid. I thought for a while that that was how best friends basically treated each other. That we showed each other all of our secrets. But then when I discovered Born, I realized the truth. She actually moved away a few years later, before I got to 5th grade. I don't know what happened to her. I think I might have met her again during my freshman year, as I met someone that looked like her and had her same name. She even acted as if she knew me, but I really don't know if it was her because I really don't remember her last name. But that was some time ago. I've had trichotillomania since I was 6, which is a nervous habit of pulling your hair out. I remember the first day I ever started pulling. I was at my great aunt's house and it was my eyelashes. I pulled nearly all of them out, and the next morning, when my mom came to my bed to wake me up, she freaked the fuck out, like crying and asking me what I had done. I didn't understand at the time that it was an anxiety problem, so I just told her I didn't know why I did it. She yelled at me about it and told like everyone in our family about it. This made it into this humiliating ordeal for me, in turn making my anxiety worse and making me want to pull more. I distinctly remember one day after kindergarten, she made me come up to her and looked closely at my eyelashes to see if I had pulled some out that day. I had, and she got pissed and threatened to make me go tell my teacher what I had done. She also brought it up in front of my doctor and got him to tell me how I could damage my hair follicles, resulting in permanent hair loss. I felt like a freak and was humiliated by this habit because of the way my mom would expose or threaten to expose my habit to other people. Looking back, I realize that she was probably trying to help me stop, but holy shit, that was the wrong way to handle it. I still pull my hair out now at 25 years old and was comforted to learn in my teens that many people suffer from this awful habit. I actually confronted my mother about the way she would yell and purposely embarrass me for it last year. She said that she told my grandmother the first time I pulled out my eyelashes, and my grandma told her, "Don't you yell at that baby." But she did anyway. I told her that the way she handled it was wrong and she should have listened to her mom, because she made my anxiety worse by the way she reacted. Now that I have a child of my own, I cannot imagine ever treating her that way if she was showing signs of severe anxiety at such a young age. I would talk to her, ask her what was wrong, take her to therapy, just show general concern, not try to punish and humiliate her into stopping. It seems really cruel to me when I think back on how much shame I felt as a young child because of my mom's actions. My mom loves me and is otherwise great, but I cannot for the life of me figure out why the fact she treated me that way. I truly hope it was ignorance, but it felt like cruelty. I love my mom so much, but this is something I have yet to forgive her for, and she didn't ever apologize after I confronted her. One of my earliest memories as a kid. I was probably 3 or 4. My mom would take me to her friend's house during the day. Her friend lived by the beach, so we would either go to the beach before and or afterwards. My older brother and sister would be at school and my dad was at work. Well, she would park me in front of the TV and I would zone out and watch some random cartoon or whatever. Her friend had a red parrot that wasn't in a cage. I always remembered my mother would tell me whenever we would go over, "Don't touch the bird, it will bite your finger off." I always remembered that bird because I always wondered what was the deal with it. I didn't remember much from going to the house besides that bird. Didn't remember what we really did there too. Years later, I was talking to my brother and sister about kid stuff. I asked them what was up with mom's friend and that bird. They both got silent and looked really pissed. My sister, who is 10 years older and much more aware of the things happening when we were younger, told me that was our mother's boyfriend she cheated with on dad. It all came rushing back. I was always alone in the living room as a kid. I remember going a lot because this dude lived by the beach, also he a cool bird. I remembered my mom telling me don't tell my siblings what we did and that we went to the beach because they would be jealous. Totally faked me up when I realized it in my teens. Parents divorced shortly after. Mom was a big old cheater. She ended up having another side dude she actually married like 6 months after my parents got separated. I was always for some reason, and still am a bit, suspicious of any and every male figure in my life growing up. Whether they were family or some random stranger. I never let anyone touch me, and if I thought they were getting too close I'd quickly move away. I always thought everyone wanted to violate me, and I never wanted that to be able to happen. I can't help but wonder if maybe something happened when I was younger that I sort of suppressed the memory, but still have the instincts to be alert of anyone male. Also, a very sad story about my younger cousin. She was around 5 at the time, and I was maybe 9 or so. I remember her having this friend her age named Riley. Now, I don't know why, but my cousin's parents would let their 5-year-old daughter sleep over at some random kid's house. So one day, my cousin tells me something about Riley's older brother who was around 13. She says that he put her privates against his. Cousin also says that he made her take her clothes off and do this while his sister was downstairs doing something with the mom. Apparently this sicko saw that as a chance to rape a 5-year-old. I don't remember the boy's name, but he'd be over 18 now. My aunt and uncle brought them to court, but unfortunately never got anything filed against that family. I still wonder to this day how my cousin is doing and if she even remembers. They didn't bring it back up again after it happened for her sake, but boy do I bet her parents are regretting letting her stay over there. I started looking at porn when I was maybe 9. I had found my dad's porn in his room, garage, and office before. When I was about 10, I went to his computer looking through the obvious places for porn, downloads, videos, internet temp files, and found a hidden folder in System 32 with a boatload of porn of girls about my age. I thought, oh wow, awesome. They make porn for people my age. And looked at it for an hour and then snuck off. I thought it was odd that they were having sex with middle-aged men, but I didn't think too much more of that. I randomly remembered that when I was 16 and was sick to my stomach, the file name of one in particular always stuck out in my mind. Little girls faking hardpoint moth. Ugh. I hate my dad. It still makes me sick to my mind, and the worst part is that I still remember the videos and can see the scenes playing out in my head exactly the way I saw them, only now it's sickening because I actually know how faked up it is. Also, a dad bonus, when I was 12, I had a 12-year-old girlfriend. She had a 13-year-old sister who was kind of awkward, but she was really close friends with my dad. I'd see them walking around holding hands, and she'd occasionally sit in his lap when her mom wasn't around. I remembered this afterward, and it brought fresh waves of sickness on. As a kid I used to draw a lot, and today I'm an artist. However, my father used to be very cruel about it when I was a kid, always telling me I would never amount to anything, or that I didn't deserve a good-looking and smart partner because he didn't like how I dressed. Everyone would easily yell at each other at my house and never apologize. My sister told me she hated me more than once. When I was 11 everyone started telling me how I was a grown-up now and I should stop watching cartoons. If my father paid for something, like a trip, he would act like it was a selfless thing to do and that he was happy about me. He would, and still does, then use it against me when I did something he didn't like fail a class. I used to draw animals and furries as a kid, before I even knew what a furry was. I just liked this cool werewolf that looked more like a secret agent than a beast. My parents accused me of zoophilia when I was 12 for that. It took years to realize this is another form of abuse, but I remember my therapist asking me what I thought about the violence in my house, and I answered there wasn't any. He pointed out how that wasn't true, and I just answered, aren't all families like this? I've got a couple. I hope it's okay to share multiple. When I was really young, maybe preschool or kindergarten, my godmother would come to the Walmart during my recess and hang on the chain link fence and talk to me. She's never hurt anyone or anything, but it's mad faked up that a school next to a Walmart would have a chain link fence and no adult supervision during recess. When I was 8 or 9, I went to a summer camp with my aunt's church. It was a sleepaway, so there were showers that had only curtains for privacy. I was undressed, and one of the children's ministers called my name from the other side of the curtain. I yelled, "Don't come in," I'm naked, and she pulled the curtain back anyway. I honestly don't remember what she wanted or what happened after that, but while I was angry I didn't really understand the implications. When I was a preteen, I was with my cousin in a used bookstore in a college town when two college guys came up to us and offered to take us to the comic book store down the street. My cousin, who was in her early teens, politely declined. Good thing too, because I didn't think anything of it and wanted to go. Come to find out, a few days later a sex trafficking ring was busted in the same town, with girls around my age. My mom barely drinks, now that I'm in my 20s. So, when I say that this happened when I was 4, you'll know she couldn't have been drunk. It was one of those rare nights where my mom, her sister, and her sisters-in-law would be able to go out. I was at my aunt's Mills for the night with the other kids. Nothing strange. Then, in the middle of the night, my mom, who did not look anything like my mom, so white that her freckles weren't visible, and she looked dead dark circles under her eyes and her pupils so big her eyes were black, came in to check on me before sleeping, and I remember screaming and wailing, because I didn't believe it was her. Hell, I apparently kicked her in the face, and broke one of her teeth. She told me she was drunk. It took me until I was 16 to realize she was lying. I confronted her, and she admitted that one of my father's friends had roofied her that night, and had it not been for my aunt noticing and getting her home, would have raped her. Dad was away on business, but when he came home he beat this man almost to death, and got away with it, because folks have seen this man do that to women a lot but none of the victims would talk. It scares me to think I almost potentially lost my mom. My mom used to drive me to drums class and back once a week, and keep in mind this was a 1-hour drive through a highly populated city. This one time she kept falling asleep behind the wheel, and I nudged at her and asked what was wrong. She said she was just a bit tired, so I shrugged. Then out of nowhere it happened again, and we hit a huge truck. I don't think they noticed, and luckily we were moving very slowly. I didn't know what to do the whole time, and I was extremely anxious. Cars behind us would honk to make us move. I felt so relieved when we finally reached home. Way later I realized that it was because she was on medication due to her mental health. Now that I think about it, why in the actual fact didn't they just let me take a cab? Another story in a different trip for my classes was she told me that alcohol is really good for you and that it's present in homeopathy medicine. She then tells me to reach down below the car seat and get her a bottle of whiskey. I didn't really think twice and gave it to her. She then asked me to take a sip of it, but it didn't seem like her. It felt so out of the blue, but she kind of forced it on me. I think took the tiniest sip possible and little me thought it was disgusting. This time I think was the peak of her bipolarity. I did tell my dad about this one and told him where she hides the alcohol. The next day the bag was gone. Gave a 7th class report entitled Isaac Newton, alias Fig, which got a laugh from the class and a sentence of 3 swats with a wooden paddle, scheduled in a stairwell after school. My English teacher, a football coach, borrowed a 3-foot varnished pine paddle from the science teacher in the next room. They took me out of detention at the scheduled time, 2 teachers, both grinning, with 1 paddle. In my part of the Midwest, swats with a wooden board were allowed, if done with a witness present, and administered to the ass between the victim's buttocks and above the knees. While the total number of swats collected during the course of the academic year was somewhat of a badge of honor for college prepays wanting to be bad boys, they hurt like hell and left bruises that would last 2 weeks. The teachers who gave swats had their own reputations and their individual paddles were known for, say, size, or having a special pattern of drilled holes for better speed. But the part that seemed unfair in my case was that the science teacher's paddle split in half on my English teacher's 5th excruciating swat. So the science teacher left the stairwell and returned with another paddle borrowed from the civics teacher down the hall. He then proceeded to give me 5 more swats for breaking his paddle. Thinking back, the whole scene strikes me as thuggish and Machiavellian. Devious little sheet that I was, I did seek revenge in my own way, although it was unsatisfying, because the results were never clear. All 3 of those teachers were coaches, and thus had their own locker room, and showers next to ours in the gym. One evening after school I put 3 chicken bouillon cubes inside each of their shower heads. I remember this act giving me great comfort and partial closure, but I frankly don't think anyone ever noticed. I was young, 8 or 9 maybe, and hanging out with my favorite uncle. He was a karate instructor at a cool place that had a dojo, jungle gym, arcade, and snack bar. On our way home he needed to stop by his old job to pick something up, but I was exhausted, so I begged to stay in the car. He finally caved and left me to snooze in his car with the keys in while he ran in real quick. Now, his old job was in the Bronx and this was a calm afternoon, so the streets weren't busy, and he found an easy parking spot in front of his old job. I remember waking up with a strange man in the driver's seat. He turned to me and said, "Your dad said to go into the karate dojo, go on." So sleepy me got out of the car, crossed the 6-lane street, no crosswalk, and walked into the old dojo. My uncle spots me not 10 seconds after and panics saying, "Why, are you in here?" Me. The man said Papa wanted me to come inside. Uncle, what man? By this time I started to come to, and just as fast he left, my uncle came back in, and in a panic, said his car was stolen. Someone called the cops. My uncle hugged me, and eventually a cop took us home to my grandparents. I don't remember a lot of what was going on that day. My dad was at my grandparents downstairs in the dining room. I guess everyone had heard what had happened, and was relieved I was okay. Not my father, though. He stood and yelled at me. Why did I get out of the car? How could I let this happen? What was I thinking? He wasn't yelling at my uncle, who'd left a young child in a car alone in the Bronx. He was yelling at me for somehow not stopping a man from stealing the car. I don't know if anyone chastised him for his reaction, because I ran upstairs to my uncle's room. He was playing a game with 2 friends to calm down after the theft. I ran to him, crying, and threw myself at him. To hell with the game. Me, you're not mad I got out of the car, right? Uncle, of course not. I can't replace you. My wallet, the car, my stuff. I can buy all that back, but I can't get another you. He handed me a controller and we played Phantasy Star Online with his friends. I know my uncle got chewed out by both sets of grandparents and my mother, and it took 2 years before anyone trusted him to take me out for fun activities again. I didn't realize at the time how faked up it was that my father yelled at me for getting out of the car. To this day I've not confronted him about how faked up that was. At times I still beat myself up that I shoulder grabbed my uncle's backpack when I got out. Edit. Grammar check. My mom has a very codependent relationship with my dad. It was much worse growing up than now. She has mastered the art of enabling to a T. She was a good mom overall, but the chaos we lived in cast a dark shadow. My father has always been a severe alcoholic, drug user, emotionally abusive, a cheater, and downright scary at times. Each night we knew, if he wasn't home by 8, there was going to be an incident, one of dad's temper tantrums, when he came home. Mom argued and yelled, they fought, furniture destroyed, cops sometimes called, suicide threats. Being a little kid, seeing your dad stand in the yard and hold a gun to his head is hard to process. She moved us in and out with relatives and even to apartments. Things would be peaceful and we would get adjusted just to move back home, and it happened again and again. As an adult I see my mother was simply doing this in an attempt to have some kind of control. What she could control is where we ended up, and would hold us over his head, threaten to leave again, and so forth. We moved out till he would break down and promise change. It never changed. I remember teachers and counselors calling me out to try to discuss home life things in private, all the way from K to junior high. Mom was always too mentally caught up in being a martyr to really pay us attention. We never had money or food in the house because dad used it up. My grandma mostly footed the bill for our needs. Expressing negative feelings led to guilt trips about how everything is against her. I spent most of my time talking to imaginary friends and walking in the woods. Her patience was always limited, and I don't remember any in-depth conversations about anything. Her description of sex was sperm fertilizes the egg, that's it. I just shut down and withdrew. My brother fell into a life of hard drug use. My parents' relationship is still dysfunctional in a different way. I have always seen my mother as a victim and my brother and dad as the problem. I would continuously spin my wheels trying to help her, stick up for her, etc. As an adult, I see how ridiculous this is, and clearly see the part she played. I'm there for her, and provide a ear or advice, a place to get away, but have learned to let it be. She had other options, lots of them. Hell, my grandfather tried to pay her a large sum of money to leave my dad. She chose to be entangled with my father, leading us to believe she couldn't make it on her own. He did nothing for us, and didn't even act like he liked us. Now he's just a sickly old man, racked with guilt, who drinks, pops pills and makes anyone around him miserable. She just sits right under him, working herself to death, losing her health, and has no life. I was going to make a throwaway for this but so decided, fuck it. If people who know my username read it, they won't judge me. Anyway, growing up, I always had this faked up dream. I was in a room with some other kids, and an older kid, who always had a blurry face, forced us to get into a bed, and made us take off our clothes, and then he would touch us and laugh. I always just thought it was some weird recurring dream. But when I was like 17 I started having the dream like every other night, and I finally asked my mom about it, and she just broke down. Turns out I was molested by one of my parents' friends' kids who was like 17 at the time. I was about 4. It only happened that one time, but it left its scars. Finding out it happened made me feel worse. My mom said she didn't think I remembered, and I never said anything, so she didn't either. They found out cause they walked in on us, which was never in the dream. We were Mormon growing up, none of us are anymore, so other than talking to the bishop, nothing happened to that kid, and he even went on a mission a few years later, according to my mom. I have no idea where he is now though, as that was almost 30 years ago. I didn't know that relations with alcohol weren't supposed to be so casual and abusive. I always thought that anytime someone drank to have a good time that meant that it was always going to end in violence. I had no friends in college because everyone thought I was too stuck up because I refused to go to any parties where drinking was involved. When I was little my dad would get very drunk and blow smoke into my face, break windows, and threaten to hit my mom. One window even broke on me while I was hiding in my parents' room because somehow my dad found his way home when my mom left him to sleep it off at someone's house. He was trying to break back in. Everyone on my dad's side of the family drove drunk. Only men were to drive, and it didn't matter if they were smashed or there were kids in the car. My stepfather was equally shitty and even more violent. I would have to blow into the breathalyzer in his truck to keep it on because he was drinking at 7 AM while driving me to school. Loud shouting matches and broken things were common at home during that time. He once threatened to hit me, but by then I was 12 and I had a bat. I promised him I would go for his replaced knee if he came at me. The kicker was that everyone knew. My dad's side of the family, my mom's side, and my stepfather's side. No one said anything in defense of us kids. No one thought to stop the bullshit. But I was the bad, troubled kid for never wanting to go to social family functions. If I didn't go, then my access to the internet was cut as punishment. I'm in my 30s now and refuse to be around drunk people or to ever drink. I guess it's not one single memory, but rather putting several together to work out the truth. My father was an alcoholic. He spent all our money on alcohol, but thankfully was never abusive. He was kinda just a dumb, kind drunk. Like mum told me one time he forgot his keys and didn't want to disturb anyone, so he slept outside on the patio. That sort's a shit. Anyway, my dad's alcoholism got so bad that when my mum said it's me and the kids, or the alcohol, he chose the alcohol. So he moved away for a bit. When my dad was away my mum had a friend. He was weird. I didn't like him. As a young kid I already had anxiety and didn't like most adults my parents were friends with, especially men. Anyway, he and my mum spent a lot of time together. And he didn't have a job, but my sister and I started getting way cooler stuff and we could buy clothes and toys brand new from the store. Turn out my mum was having a fling with this guy she saved from a heroin overdose and now they were using our house to sell drugs to the neighborhood, including all the parents on my school's board. My street has always been in a bad area. There was a race fight with an axe, a madam's business, more drugs, bashings, more drugs. I thought it was normal until I grew up to realize that some people don't have security screens on their windows and don't double lock every door on their house. For me, the worst I got was neglect for most of my upbringing, but I was terrible to my brothers. I didn't think I was either. I've only recently started realizing how wrong some of the things I did were. It started normally enough. One of my brothers, I'm the oldest, with each brother being born in 2.5-year intervals after me, wouldn't do what I wanted. Hit him on the head, arm, stomach, etc. I'm sure most siblings will occasionally bonk each other here or there. Eventually, though, as all kids do, they developed more willpower, so my methods to convince them had to become more forceful. Holding their arms behind their backs painfully, choking them, just any kind of forceful physical punishment that didn't intentionally injure, but caused pain. At least I wasn't cruel enough to hit their junk. I realize now that I was a menace, a source of fear and pain, an abuser, and my parents were so overwhelmed with each other as well as 4 kids that they didn't have control over me. It all stemmed from my mom's belief that your elders get to make the decisions and anyone younger than them has to obey. She never verbally said this, but she was raised in that kind of environment, and it was clear enough to me through her behavior that I adopted it. I'm scared of the damage I've caused my brothers. We all have problems, but I'm afraid for the eldest, 2.5 years younger than me, as he says he remembers a repressed memory sometimes, and it causes him intense head pain. He also had several breakdowns during school, and is socially inept. I feel like I'm responsible for his problems because of how I abused him, but I'm going off topic now. Basically, I didn't realize I abused my brothers until recently, and it's pretty faked up. I thought they were in the wrong for not obeying me because I was their older brother, but I was just a tyrant. When I was about 10 or 11, I wanted a woman attempt suicide. My father had abandoned my mother after she had gotten sick with a degenerative disease. Unsurprisingly, he was abusive and alcoholic. See his opportunity, he took off. Years later, he came back while mom was at a low point with the disease and stolen my 2 younger siblings. He took us across state lines and had his family threaten my deathly ill mom to keep her from coming after us, legally or otherwise. Not that she could have, sick as she was. My father, as expected, was generally terrible at parenting and left the majority of it to me. I was responsible for feeding my siblings, getting them to school, and watching them. My only regret is that I wasn't more mature at that age. I was so focused on trying to be a kid and wanting to do my own thing that my siblings were even more neglected. I know, in retrospect, that it wasn't my responsibility, but I don't think that guilt will ever go away. It was either a Sironi or McDonald's for dinner, and sometimes dad spent more money on booze than food. I wouldn't eat, so my siblings could get enough. We all suffered in school. We slept in the same room to comfort one another. I didn't know if mom was alive or dead. My father started dating a mentally ill woman who was mystifyingly taken with him. At some point, their relationship soured, and this woman stormed into our house one evening, screaming. She proceeded to lock herself in our bathroom and attempt suicide by cutting her legs and wrists. My father rode to the hospital with her. I stayed behind and distracted my siblings with a movie so I could clean the blood before they saw it. It was so much blood. It wasn't until years later, when we were reunited with our mom, that I told her about it. She blanched. At the time, I didn't realize just how faked everything had been for us. The older I get, the more horrifying it is. When I was 11, I didn't think anything of it. I still dream about her blood, about trying to get the stain out of the carpet before my kid siblings see. When I was about 5, some men would play frisbee outside with me. It was a fun time. One day, they invited me into their apartment to pet some kittens. I had never held a kitten before, so I was absolutely elated. They took pictures of me holding the kittens and even printed one out and gave it to my mom, who naturally freaked out. That's the same age that the white streak I have in my hair showed up randomly. Don't tell me it's a faking birthmark. I'm pretty sure my mom would notice that this spot on my forehead had no pigment. I remember her washing my hair and freaking out. Whether these events are related, I don't know. There were many traumatic events in my childhood. These men were probably grooming me. I don't remember ever seeing them after holding their kittens. My childhood best friend told me stories that her dad told about a ghost woman being shackled in their yard, and if you're real quiet, you can hear her chains rattling in the night. That made me terrified to ever go into their yard. They had moved to a farm town about 45 minutes away when I was in middle school. Her dad said there was an owl haunting them in their house. He also kept a glass jar on the door handle at night as security. Her parents often hung out in their bedroom with the door closed and were not to be disturbed. I thought it was weird, but that's about it, as my friends seemed happy. Years later, she told me they were heavily into meth. A lot of things cleared up for me. I don't talk to any of them anymore, but they have been clean for over 10 years now, other than her dad smoking weed and cigarettes. Her mom has rap, so she's always on painkillers and steroids. They love their grandkids, so I think they will refrain from using ever again. My dad is emotionally abusive, and he would do things like take us walking in woods and disappear until we found him, or put me in a room if I didn't say sorry for something I did. I told my mum about things like this. They are divorced, so this was with them, and she would ask him to stop. She wanted him to be good, and it took a little while until she realized he wasn't going to change, and she said if we didn't want to go we wouldn't have to, but she didn't have a choice. Since she works 2 jobs she had to send us there, and he would say I lied, and those things never happened, and he'd keep doing that and saying I was happy when he called me names and did stuff like I said. I started not trusting my own memories and feeling guilty, and begged mum to stop telling him off, because every time she did it got worse, and we were stuck for years like that. He started saying he wouldn't give me seconds of food, watch the sweets, and you need to tone up. Things that all skirted around something he thought that I was fat, and I wasn't, which almost made me anorexic. I lost a kilo in a month before my mum and the doctor could pull me out before it got too deep. Nobody talks about emotional abuse, and I didn't know this wasn't normal for years. No one says that things like this affect social interactions and trust, and little though the single acts seem, they chip away at you. I'm out of it now and getting better. I developed depression and anxiety partially because of this, partially because other things, and I want to say to anyone with things like this, you are not alone. You can make it through. There was a guy one street over named Mark. He was maybe in his 30s and lived alone on a semi-rural property. My friend and I were little girls and about 8 years old. Our parents let us roam free within the neighborhood boundaries until the sun went down. My friend kept telling me about Mark, how he had all kinds of cool stuff in his backyard, and how he always had candy and video games in his house. I thought it was weird that she was on first name basis with a dude that lived a street over without any kids, but there was another old lady on our street that we called the Cookie Lady. She loved to bake and would hand out little cookies to kids that knocked on her door. Anyways, I never knew when she was over at his house. I guess whenever she wasn't playing with me, she was over there. She tried to get me to go with her a few times, but I just got a bad feeling about it. Like, why would I want to go to a middle-aged man's house to play? My friend never confided that he was doing anything inappropriate with her, but going into our teen years she got heavily into drugs and drinking and slipped into a deep depression. She started cutting herself in grade 6 and locked herself in the bathroom a couple times and came out with cut marks on her arms. It's only when I grew up I put 2 and 2 together. I put Mark and the address of his house into Google one day to see if he might have been a sex offender. He was arrested when I was 14 for child porn. No such offenses against children though, so I assume she never told anyone. I'm positive he molested her for at least 2 years and was trying to get her to bring me there to get groomed as well. I mean, it's not that I knew it wasn't faked up, but just like, I don't know, here I have a few. 1. I grew up with a single mom. who was an immigrant, so she didn't have family up here, and she worked 14 hours a day sometimes, and go hungry, just so she could make sure I ate. Didn't have to be this way for the most part, she just had no clue how to manage money tbh. But anyways, I would come home from school at 3 PM and just play video games until 11 PM to 1 AM. Every single day, and go to school, because she was never home. Sometimes I wouldn't eat, because I wasn't sure how to cook yet, so for the most part one raised myself for a good 3 to 5 years. 2. When I was really young, this faked up teenage guy I knew started beating his dick. I'm 7 or something by the way, and he was in front of me, and innocent me had no clue what he was doing, or what the fuck it was, so I asked if he could touch it, and yeah, we are not going down this rabbit hole. 3. My dad was an alcoholic, and whenever I'd go to his house he was usually verbally abusive. He'd drive drunk, and he'd force me to watch horror movies like The Exorcist and whatnot. Honestly, I have memory of pulling the blankets over my face and eyes trying to not watch some vampire movie from back in the day. 4. My mom and her boyfriend was like 8 to 9 at the time maybe, would leave me out in the living room with only his dog for company for hours. I didn't know what they were doing, and I was told to not even come near the door, so I sat there, no TV, nothing, just the dog for hours. I never heard a sound either. Every male figure in my life has been a shitty human being, and every female figure in my life has never stuck around or spent enough time with me to leave an impression. My ex's mom and dad were the closest thing that I had to consider real family, but my ex broke up with me, so it'd be weird if I just messaged them. Honestly, I'm 19 in 2 months and I know I'm faked up. I think about ending it all on the daily and so much more than that, but I hide it pretty well. Edit. There's probably more, but this is enough for edit. Edit. My grandmother was a homeopathic doctor, I think it's called, and she'd have pills and stuff all over the place on shelves and sheet that I probably wasn't supposed to reach. Anyways, the pills were special sugar pills mixed in with whatever medicine she needed to prescribe. Little me would pop them like candy by climbing onto the couch and stealing them and just chewing on them and sheet. Edit to my edit. As a kid I told my grandmother that I only ate maybe once a day at school since my mom was never home or never cooked, and so if it was okay if I asked her to make me some food. It was almost midnight or 1 AM and she was just horrified and said yes and started making me food. I love my grandma,